lessons that we want to share with you, but actual on-the-ground implementation that we want to put on record during this review. Madam President, if you look at implementation, we are preparing draft legislation on occupational safety, health and welfare at work, and this is being done by the Ministry of Labour and Labour Relations under labour rights. We are looking at directives having been issued by the police department to ensure physical safety of persons taken into custody and the provision of access to legal counsel as of right under the theme of torture. This has already been issued. The adoption and implementation of a national trilingual policy, as well as the enhancement of scope and reach of National Vocational Qualification, NVQ, by the Tertiary and Vocational Education Commission under Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Sri Lanka is a multilingual nation, and we have given pride and place to the implementation of the National Trilingual Policy. Accelerated demining and awareness raising among IDPs of risks due to mines and unexploded ordnance, UXOs under rights of IDPs. Implementation of the National Action Plan supporting the Prevention of Domestic Violence Act of 2005 under rights of women. Strengthening capacity to support child helpline under rights of children. Establishment by the Sri Lanka Police Department of a special unit to combat human smuggling and trafficking under rights of migrant workers. Completion of review and improvement of training syllabus and period of training for police officers on human rights and language training, especially Tamil language training under civil and political rights. The objective of this program is to ensure that police officers who are conversant with the language are serving in areas in which the majority speak that language. Madam President, this is not all. There are many other areas of implementation, and I will put on record furthermore areas that we would like to share with you. As you can see, we have in fact commenced the implementation of the NHRAP, and those who raise questions as to the lack of progress may be reassured by these specific examples. We will continue to provide updates to the Council on further progress. This also outlines the major vehicle availed of to implement the outcome of the 2008 UPR. What must be borne in mind is the fact that the 2008 UPR took place at a critical juncture in Sri Lanka's nearly 3-decade-long war against terrorism. Almost a year earlier, the LTT had been defeated in the Eastern Theatre, and measures to ensure return to civilian life were being implemented. Soon after the review, the final phase of the humanitarian operation was launched to rescue the civilians who were being held by the LTT in the northern province of Sri Lanka. A sea change occurred approximately 12 months after the 2008 UPR, with the rescue of nearly 300,000 civilians in the month of May 2009. What is of special significance is that our engagement with the community of nations, especially in the Human Rights Council, never lessened in intensity. And we regularly brief the Council of contemporary developments in Sri Lanka during the most difficult of times during the humanitarian operation. I myself have come to this Council many times, and we have not only briefed the Council in its plenary, we have even gone to the extent of briefing regional groups, interregional groups, and many bilateral meetings have been held during this period. Madam President, Sri Lanka, like any post-conflict polity, faced challenges of a magnitude and scope that were truly daunting. The housing and maintenance of hundreds of thousands of civilians, restoring security, law and order, clearing of vast tracts of land contaminated by UXO, including IEDs and landmines, restoring physical, administrative, economic and social infrastructure, preparing people for resettlement, identifying ex-combatants for rehabilitative care, the transition from humanitarian assistance to a development phase, all while maintaining a stable economy and sustainable growth in the rest of the country, were just some of the tasks that the government had to contend with. At the same time, we were not complacent, but tried our utmost to prevent and forestall acts of destabilization from within and outside the country. There are still some elements that support the LTT's cause of dismemberment and separation of our island nation. We are aware of these initiatives and will defeat them by our ongoing strategy of redemocratization, reconciliation, reconstruction, and development. Madam President, conflict touches the lives of everyone. When armed conflict continues for as long as 30 years, as it did in Sri Lanka, it affects generations of people. It is for this reason that the government has placed such primacy on non-repetition of the mistakes of the past and on genuine reconciliation. No one who lived through the conflict would want their children or their children's children to experience what Sri Lanka collectively experienced in the past 30 years. We are aware that reconciliation is not easy exercise, nor is it one that can be achieved overnight. Some of our friends, by way of questions posed, have indicated a desire to see a more comprehensive approach taken with regard to the allegedly disappeared. The UN Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances has long engaged with successive governments to clear long outstanding backlog of 5,679 cases. I must note that many of these cases, over 4,000, date back over 20 years to the pre-1990 period. A further 1,089 date back to the 1991-2005 period. The remaining number lays to rest the canard of an increasing trend in disappearance in the recent past. We are working to establish a cross-agency national mechanism to clear this backlog. A working committee has been established to respond to cases of disappearances, and a Deputy Inspector General of Police appointed to conduct ground verifications of such cases to ascertain the present status. A special piece of legislation to enable the issuance of death certificates to next of kin was put in place, and next of kin can now claim monies due to them and obtain to secure a substantial degree of closure. Madam President, as a part of implementing our responsibilities, the government submitted its response on 59 cases of disappearances recently brought to its attention by the working group. Another set of 100 cases referred by the working group has been verified, and we have already submitted this as well. Initial investigations have revealed that nearly 50% of these cases have not been complained of to law enforcement in Sri Lanka. Further investigations are being conducted on the remaining allegations communicated by the group. I must note that a comprehensive addressing of this challenge would be greatly facilitated if countries that have received thousands of asylum seekers would cooperate with us by giving us the names of such persons of Sri Lankan origin, so that a proper comparison with the allegedly missing can be done. One of the questions we received has pointed out that the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka has recorded 230 cases of disappearances in 2011. However, if recourse is had to the National Report of Sri Lanka, detailed information as to complaints of allegedly missing persons and persons abducted in 2010 and 2011 may be accessed. This information is presented together with the remarkable success rate of the Sri Lankan authorities, who have resolved a great many of these supposed disappearances. The total number of persons reported allegedly missing in 2010 was 7,940, out of which 6,653, Madam President, have been found. The corresponding numbers of 2011 are 7,296 reported and 5,185 traced. In 2010, the number of persons allegedly abducted was 225, of whom 207 were later traced. The number of allegedly abducted in 2011 was 239, of whom 226 have been traced. Outstanding allegations must and will be thoroughly investigated and any offenders brought to book. Madam President, one other question received was in respect of freedom of association, thought, conscience, and expression to receive constitutional recognition. Our civil society has a long history of persons who have advocated for the rights of victims, the disadvantaged and the marginalized. Persons can canvass for the protection of these rights before courts of law. Civil society activists at all levels have freedom to jointly or in association with others form non-governmental organizations and community-based organizations. Organizations established as trust, voluntary social service organizations, or as private companies. They may seek registration at the national level if they require further facilitation by the government. This registration is not mandatory. The allegations of intolerance or attacks against these organizations or their leadership in verbal or other form emanate from time to time. I must state with the utmost firmness that these alleged attacks are no part of government policy to stifle criticism, activism, or dissent. Neither does the government condone any such attacks. As far as civil society activists who wish to engage with the government is concerned, in general, they are a valued partner. And in the implementation of the NHRAP, we hope to work very closely with them. Madam President, several countries have also sought clarifications as to the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, LLRC for short. This is the domestic process, and the implementation of its action plan, published in July this year, pursuant to a decision by the Cabinet of Ministers. The President, His Excellency Mahinda Rajapaksa, appointed the LLRC in May 2010 in order to strengthen the national reconciliation process and to ensure the dividends of peace to all Sri Lankans. The Cabinet of Ministers in May 2012 decided that a task force headed by the Secretary to the President would monitor the implementation of the recommendations of the LLRC. In July, a matrix containing the National Plan of Action to implement the LLRC recommendations developed by the task force and presented to Cabinet was approved, setting out the main focus areas for implementation. Madam President, you may recall that the primary focus of the ill-conceived March 2012 resolution in this Council was the implementation of the LLRC report. Long before the adoption of the resolution, we assured the Council that we are committed to the implementation of the domestic process by way of an action plan, and that we should be given time and space to achieve this objective. We have fulfilled our commitment with a clear time frame for implementation, which is in process as we speak. The main focus areas are IHL issues, human rights, land return and resettlement, restitution, compensatory relief, and reconciliation. The task force has identified the corresponding activity and implementing agency, a key performance indicator, and a time frame in respect of each recommendation. I must reiterate that the action plan and its implementation is being spearheaded by the most senior officials of the government. One is seated just to my right. Ministries and agencies have been requested to forward their budgetary requirements to aid in the implementation of the actions within their purview, commencing with the national budgetary process for 2013. Madam President, several thematic subcommittees functioning under an APEX task force is envisaged for better coordination and implementation. Some countries have expressed concerns that only some proposals have been included for implementation. It must be pointed out that 285 was the sum total of observations and recommendations of the LLRC. There was some duplication in Chapter 9 of the LLRC report. Moreover, some of the recommendations fall under the ambit and scope of the National Human Rights Action Plan. The action plan is based on what is implementable in the short, medium and long terms, and the overall recommendations are further subdivided on a thematic basis into policy and practical matters. The four main subdivisions relate to national policy, the final phase of the conflict, recommendations related to human rights and national security concerns, and recommendations related to resettlement and development. Certain matters of broad national policy in the action plan are to be referred to the proposed Parliamentary Select Committee, which is in process of being established. Madam President, several questions received by us on the LLRC action plan ask for specific examples of completion or substantial progress on activities. This is justified. Like the NHRAP, we are happy to share with our friends actual implementation since its approval by Cabinet in July 2012. Just a mere 3-4 months. The implemented areas so far as follows: devising a centralized database of missing persons, implementing the Registration of Deaths Act 2010, creating a centralized database of detainees and make access available to next of kin, screening detainees to identify those with special needs, examination of cases of young ex-combatants, release and reunification with their families, establish a task force to develop and implement a child tracing program, ensure freedom of movement for media including in the north and east, remove restrictions on visiting places of worship, allow visitors from overseas to visit recently resettled areas. Many have made use of this opportunity, and free movement of persons on the Kandy-Jaffna A9 highway. Hence the suggestion that only part of the recommendations are addressed and the critique that there is no progress in implementation is without basis. We will, of course, as in the case of the NHRAP, continue to update the Council on further progress made. Further progress has to be made, and we will do that. Madam President, further progress has been made in relation to the recommendations made on the treatment of ex-combatants. This is also part of the LLRC action plan. As of 22nd October 2012, 11,012 persons, which included 594 LTT child soldiers, have been rehabilitated and reintegrated into society. Of the approximately 12,000 persons identified as ex-combatants and provided rehabilitation, as of October 2012, only 782 beneficiaries are undergoing rehabilitation, and 262 are under judicially mandated custody, which is remand prison. Action is underway to expedite the legal proceedings, Madam President. Now I ask you, if this is not clear progress, what is clear progress? Another important recommendation of the LLRC that we have done is to implement the rapid and sustainable resettlement objective. Sustainability is of prime importance in this context, and resettled persons must be provided with durable solutions, which means that people who return must be able to lead normal, productive lives, equal or better to the life they led pre-displacement. The closure of the last IDP Welfare Center in Manik Farm by 24th of September resulted in our having to deal with only those IDPs who reside with host families and those in protracted situations of displacement. While our focus has been on the nearly 300,000 IDPs we received after the rescue in 2009, we have also paid due attention to the older caseload which we were saddled with. As at the beginning of October, a record of total resettlement, Madam President, was 501,194 persons. Among the remaining caseload are the Muslim residents of the north who were forcibly evicted by the LTT in 1990 and 1991, numbering in the tens of thousands, in pursuance of their policy of ethnic cleansing. Thousands of Sinhalese were similarly evicted by the LTT from these areas. We are clarifying the remaining number of displaced of every category and will put into place programs of resettlement for all those who wish to return. To aid in the process of resettlement, the total number of houses constructed in the northern and eastern provinces up to September 2012, 124,184 at a cost of rupees 33.34 billion from 2005. Needless to say, we are justifiably proud of our achievement. This is another example of implementation of a recommendation of the domestic process, the LLRC. Madam President, Sri Lanka's rapid progress in resettlement would not have been possible without the intensive humanitarian demining operation. It is a matter of pride that a vast majority of the work has been completed at considerable risk by the Sri Lankan Army. Initially, it was suspected that mines had been laid in an area of more than 5,000 square kilometers. Demining such a vast area was a formidable challenge that the government unhesitantly undertook immediately after the conflict ended. At present, 2,061 square kilometers have been identified as hazardous areas. The area cleared is over 1,953 square kilometers. The scale of the problem the government faced in demining can be clearly seen from the number of mines and other devices unearthed and neutralized during the demining process. Over 900,000 hazardous devices have been recovered. These include anti-tank, anti-personnel and IEDs amongst the recovered UXO. As of 25th October 2012, 98%, Madam Chairman, of the areas identified for demining have been cleared and approximately 108 square kilometers of territory remains to be cleared. This data refers to 10 districts in all, including 3 in the east, 5 in the north, and 2 in the north central province. Further demining will enable the remaining contaminated areas to be used for resettlement. The Sri Lankan Army, Madam President, was responsible for demining approximately 75% of the land, which was the largest single area assigned to any of the parties involved in demining, and included most of the densely mined regions. The entire demining program was carefully planned and executed. Priority areas were chosen to maximize efficiency and enable the speedy return of the displaced. The first was to demine towns and villages, the second to demine agricultural areas and paddy fields, and finally to clear forested areas. Presently, nearly all of the 2 main priority areas have been dealt with. Work only continues in a few areas where the concentration of mines is at its highest. Many of these places were heavy fighting places during the last stages of the conflict. It is our aim to completely clear this in the near future. I ask the question once again, Madam President, isn't this progress? As we pointed out in our national report, special emphasis has been given to regulating the activities regarding the management of land in the northern and eastern provinces. The Ministry of Land and Land Development has decided to resolve the land disputes in these areas by implementing a special program. Cabinet approval has been received for policy proposals relating to the matter. It is proposed to set in place mediation boards in terms of the Mediation Special Categories of Disputes Act to resolve disputes between owners who have paper title and who have been displaced and those of them who are in unlawful occupation as an alternate dispute resolution mechanism. Furthermore, an amendment to the prescription ordinance is presently being considered, whereby displaced or disadvantaged owners of land will be exempted from the rules of prescription during a period of 30 years so as to enable them to defeat any competing claims based on the lapse of time. Madam President, with regard to matters of accountability and the allegations as to the violations of humanitarian and human rights law, the LLRC in its report clearly states that protection of civilian life was a key factor in the formulation of government policy for carrying out military operations, and the deliberate targeting of civilians formed no part of that strategy. We have pointed out in our national report that the government has already carried out a series of measures which will enable firm and verifiable conclusions to be arrived at on issues involving accountability without any element of conjecture or speculation. If reliable evidence is available in respect of any contravention of the law, the domestic legal process will be set in motion. I must stress that these are Sri Lankans, and our government is determined to make a full accounting of our people. As no comprehensive census has been carried out in the northern province since 1981 because of the presence of LTT, the Department of Census and Statistics was charged with the task of making an enumeration of vital events in the northern province, and this task was completed in 2011. Critical for socio-economic and development planning, the enumeration followed by an island-wide census in 2012 will provide an accurate picture of patterns of deaths, outward migration within and outside the country caused by the conflict and other reasons. A comparison of the population data from the enumeration and from the island-wide census will enable the government to gain an understanding of the magnitude and ramifications of the conflict. Causes could include LTT cadres killed in action, Card and civilians who escaped the conflict and migrated to other parts of the country and or overseas, civilians likely to have been killed in the crossfire, civilians killed by the LTT while seeking to escape from their control, false reporting and reported deaths that did not occur during the period of the humanitarian operation. The outcome will finally and conclusively lay to rest, Madam President, the unfound allegations of tens of thousands of civilian deaths alleged to have occurred in the first 5 months of 2009. I am sure that you will agree that this is indicative of a serious and systematic attempt to account for our people. Madam President, still on the subject of accountability, which I know is very close to the hearts of many of our peers, and responding to questions received, a 5-member court of inquiry was appointed on 2nd of January 2012 by virtue of the powers vested in the Army Commander under the Courts of Inquiry Regulations, read with the Army Disciplinary Regulations, promulgated by the Army Act, and is headed by a Major General. This Court of Inquiry was tasked with inquiring into the observations made by the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission in its report on alleged civilian casualties during the final phase of the humanitarian operation, and probed as regards to the Channel 4 video footage. Since its initial sitting in the first week of January 2012, as of October 2012, the Court of Inquiry has convened approximately 30 times and has examined many witnesses. It should be noted that the court is investigating more than 50 incidents referred to in the LLRC report. Investigations cover whether or not any attacks were carried out by the army on civilians, on hospitals, or in the no-fire zones, including the specific instances referred to in the LLRC report. Irrespective of whether the Channel 4 story is authentic or not, the Court of Inquiry has been mandated to take measures to ascertain whether the uniformed persons featured in the Channel 4 footage can be identified as members of the Sri Lankan Army and other violations of military law, if any. Additionally, the Sri Lankan Army has commenced investigations by appointing a board of inquiry to study the LLRC recommendations and formulate a viable action plan to implement the recommendations that are relevant to the Army. The Sri Lankan Navy has also initiated similar measures. I ask the question once again, isn't this working towards progress? Madam President, questions were also raised on the subject of torture. With regard to allegations for torture, there are several avenues for investigation and prosecution of offenders. Prosecution under the Convention Against Torture Act, complaints to the National Police Commission, complaints to the Human Rights Commission, and even a complaint to the Apex Court alleging torture are avenues available to a victim of torture or other ill treatment violative of human rights. The police also conducts internal reviews and may take action against a delinquent officer by utilizing disciplinary processes. Workshops on prevention of torture for police officers have been conducted, and many have been trained from 2009 to 2012. A new initiative with the assistance of the Asia Foundation has been launched to expand training and education of police officers and investigators. It is envisaged that prosecutors, judicial officers, and prison officers will be included. New measures taken by the police will also assist in reducing the incidence of abuse and ill treatment of persons. A circular issued in December 2011 by the Inspector General of Police ensures the safety of the persons in police custody, both male and female, would be assured. Moreover, by circular issued in May 2012, access to attorneys by persons in police custody is assured as of right. At the same time, the upgrading of interrogation and forensic investigation skills is ongoing to ensure that officers do not have to rely on coercive methods to obtain information. A question was also received by us on the status of the bill on the protection of victims and witnesses. This is something that has been coming up from time to time when I have visited Geneva. We have an answer to that. The draft legislation of 2008 has been now amended to incorporate recommendations made by the Supreme Court and the Parliamentary Consultative Committee on Justice, and has now been submitted to the Cabinet of Ministers, and upon approval will be presented to Parliament for enactment. The draft bill has been signed by the Minister of Justice. It is now before Cabinet, and the Cabinet will consider this bill, and after which it will be submitted to Parliament. Madam President, Sri Lanka has consistently engaged with the OSHR, the special procedure mechanisms, and relevant treaty bodies. In the context of the invitation extended in April 2011 to the High Commissioner for Human Rights to visit the country, a preparatory visit by a team from the OSHR was facilitated by the government in September 2012. The team was granted unfettered access and was provided with the opportunity of interacting with a broad range of stakeholders, including senior representation from government, opposition, and civil society. We invited the High Commissioner 1.5 years ago in writing. She said yes, the dates were yet to be fixed. The OSHR wanted to, before the High Commissioner's visit, send a high-level team. We said yes to that as well. That visit has taken place, and now we are waiting for the High Commissioner to give us the date when she can visit Sri Lanka. That will also be facilitated. Madam President, one concern that seems to have drawn the attention of our friends is the question of military presence in the former theatre of conflict. Here I must categorically state that there has been a significant reduction of the military strength in the north since the end of the conflict. There is no intrusive military presence impacting on civilian life in Jaffna or in the Vanni. On the contrary, the military has successfully completed a great deal of work to assist civilians return to their normal lives in the aftermath of the conflict. From May 2009 to October 2012, the Army at its own expense has constructed 4,652 permanent new houses, 6,171 semi-permanent houses, and has renovated 7,454 houses through their initiative and efforts. It has constructed 73 schools, renovated nearly 500 old school buildings, and has constructed 23 school playgrounds. The Army has made a significant contribution to the improvement of water, sanitation, and hygiene facilities. The Army has contributed to the socio-cultural needs of the people by restoring nearly 250 places of religious worship belonging to all faiths in the north. And these, Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist, all of them. Moreover, it has contributed to the repair of 11 main roads and 43 minor roads during this period. Livelihood assistance has also been facilitated by the Army. A number of medical clinics have been held and assistance provided for the conduct of religious, cultural and other festivals. The Sri Lankan Navy and Air Force also facilitated similar projects. The military has therefore delivered an outstanding contribution to the restoration of normality. It is noteworthy that these functions have now been taken over by a fully restored civilian administration. The Army no longer is involved in civilian administration. Madam President, a question was also posed as to a supposed increase in sexual violence in these areas. I'm taking time, Madam President, because there were so many questions that we had to respond to, and I thought this would be the best in the course of my statement to reply to those questions. This is on sexual violence in the areas. Sri Lanka set up special women's protection units with female police officers and women's centers in the IDP welfare centers and are continuing to provide counseling services. Strict legal action has been taken to combat sexual violence. During the 3-year span from May 2009 to May 2012, 256 sexual offences have been reported in the north in all 5 districts. 176 cases are pending hearing by the courts. 67 cases have been forwarded to the Attorney General for advice. 2 convictions have been recorded and 11 cases are currently under investigation. Any correlation between military presence and sexual violence is completely unfounded. The protection of women and the advancement of their rights has been a cornerstone of our government's policy. Especially in the post-conflict phase, the problem of women have been under scrutiny. Several projects have been initiated in this connection, including livelihood development, microfinance, self-employment, entrepreneurship, empowerment, enhancing access to law enforcement and legal remedies. There has been a special emphasis on conflict-affected women, including female-headed households. There are many as a result of the conflict. Sri Lanka has, over the past several decades, meaningfully integrated women as equal partners in shaping the economic, political and social life of the country. We recognize that civil and political rights are interlinked with social, cultural and economic rights, and that these reinforce each other. Sri Lanka ratified the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, CEDAW, in 1981 and acceded to the optional protocol in 2012. Sri Lanka's combined 5th to 7th periodic report was considered at the 48th session of the committee, and observations on concluding observations have already been submitted. Accelerated language training. Future recruitment and advancement in the public service will also depend on achievement of linguistic competence. We want everyone to speak the 2 official languages, not only Sinhalese but also Tamil. Both Tamils and Sinhalese should do that. Language is a key to confidence building among the multilingual segments of Sri Lankan society. Madam President, with the restoration of local governance structures, local civil administration, participation in national elections, and a restoration of civil consciousness, the next step would be consideration of elected provincial representation. Demining, resettlement, and the establishment of settled communities are prerequisites for democratic activity, especially at the peripheral and regional levels. There's also the question of the larger discussion of the way ahead as a nation and the institutional and other arrangements necessary to unify the people and work together for a mutually beneficial future. We also wish to re-emphasize that a central feature of the government's approach to evolving a consensus formula remains primarily the establishment of a parliamentary select committee, aimed at achieving multi-party consensus in respect of political and constitutional measures. We want to have a meeting of minds. We want to have different political ideologies representing in one room, across a table, setting their minds to what is needed in terms of political and constitutional measures to move towards comprehensive reconciliation. The motion was unanimously adopted by Parliament in November 2011. Government has already nominated its members to the PSC and is awaiting the nomination of members representing the opposition, after which its sittings can commence. Parallel with this multi-party mechanism, the government engaged in bilateral discussions with Tamil political parties as well as Muslim representation. Mindful of the fact that all previous attempts at evolving a constitutional formula failed due to a lack of consensus, the government remains optimistic that the PSC would help activate the required consensus given its inclusivity, transparency and adherence to democratic norms. Madam President, the government of Sri Lanka has expended an enormous amount of resources, time and effort by restoring normality to the conflict-affected areas. The government committed US $2.8 billion, mostly through loans, with some grant funding in support of ongoing projects in 2011. Investment in infrastructure, especially roads, railways, transport, will pave the way for restoration of livelihoods and the movement of goods. This is in addition to expenditure on humanitarian assistance and relief, where the government's commitment of 2009 and 2010 alone was US $368 million. Madam President, I have many more statistics to share with you regarding economic development, but simply to underscore the point, I would like to mention to our peers that the economic growth rate after the conflict in 2010 nationally was 7%. The growth in the conflict area in the north was 22%. In 2011, the national growth rate was 7.5%. The growth rate in the north was 27%. So you can just understand and appreciate the dividends of peace, the enormous potential that is being realized as a result of the end of the conflict. And that is why I have always said in this room, as much as we are determined to, as much as we were determined to eradicate terrorism, we are even more determined to win the peace. Madam President, we have integrated the Millennium Development Goals into the National Development Agenda. Sri Lanka is on track to reach most of the indicators. Some have been achieved already. Among the notable achievements are those relating to equitable primary education. The universal primary education net enrollment rate has reached 99% in 2009 for both males and females. Economic development must now seamlessly follow the humanitarian assistance and early recovery phases. The new UN Development Assistance Framework that will be applicable from 2013 reflects this shift in perspective and approach. We expect that in keeping with our needs and priorities, that our friends and partners will extend their understanding and cooperation to our efforts in developing a stable and prosperous Sri Lanka. Madam President, in conclusion, what we have always expected from our peers in this Council is an objective assessment of our progress. We have only asked that. We have not asked anyone to only speak in terms of friendship or bilateral relations, but an objective assessment of what we have done. We are justifiably proud of our achievements thus far, which I have outlined in great detail earlier on, and what we are asking again from our peers is an objective assessment of what we have done. We have come here in a transparent manner. We have come here to interact with our friends. We are appreciative of the fact that this UPR process has given us the opportunity to explain in detail what we have done, and this is what I have taken advantage of. But we are also prepared to consider any recommendations that our friends in the international community, our peers, may wish to suggest to us in the course of the interactive dialogue. As far as questions are concerned, I have attempted to answer as directly as possible all of the questions that we received, even questions that we received after the due date had passed. I took a decision that we should take on board all of those questions, and we have done so. And if there are further questions or clarifications that you might like to pose to us, we are prepared to interact with you. Thank you very much, Madam President, for giving me this opportunity.
Muchísimas gracias, señor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister Simara-Singh, for this major presentation made to the group. We take note definitely of the arduous efforts you have been engaged in to ensure comprehensive and sustainable reconciliation with mutual trust and to avoid relapsing into the problems of the past. Before giving the floor to the speakers on my list, I would like to say that you have 1 minute and 12 seconds. The first speaker on my list is the distinguished delegation of Thailand. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Madam President, Thailand welcomes the delegation of Sri Lanka and thanks it for its comprehensive opening statement. My delegation welcomes the report and recommendations of the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, as well as the decision of the government of Sri Lanka to establish a task force to monitor the effective implementation of the said recommendations. We recognize the efforts made to address alleged human rights violation cases, especially the issue of enforced disappearance, including the establishment of an interministerial working group on this matter. In this regard, we recommend that relevant legislations and administrative measures be further strengthened to ensure transparency and non-impunity in the judicial process on all alleged enforced disappearance cases, including investigation, prosecution, and reparation, which will help contribute towards national reconciliation. We appreciate steps taken to ensure physical safety and dignity of individuals arrested or detained in custody, including legal safeguards for eliminating all forms of ill treatment or torture in prison. Here we recommend that Sri Lanka consider incorporating the UN minimum standard rules for the treatment of prisoners and the UN rules for the treatment of women prisoners and non-custodial measures for women offenders, otherwise known as the Bangkok Rules, as part of its work on the treatment of prisoners. Thank you, Madam President.
Gracias, Excelente.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I give the floor to the Ambassador of Timor-Leste.
Timor-Leste welcomes the distinguished delegation of Sri Lanka to the 14th session of the UPR. We commend Sri Lanka for the launching of the National Human Rights Action Plan last year. It's important to note that this action plan has to be implemented in a situation following decades of armed conflict. In this connection, we welcome the establishment of the LLRC in Sri Lanka. The recommendations of the LLRC constitute an essential foundation to build a more harmonious society and to ensure that human rights of all Sri Lankan, regardless of their backgrounds, are protected. We recommend that Sri Lanka continue its effort to implement the LRC recommendations. We welcome Sri Lanka's openness to cooperate with the UN human rights mechanisms, in particular with the Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances. We recommend that this cooperation be intensified to establish the fate of those who may have not been accounted for at the end of the armed conflict. We wish Sri Lanka all the success in its effort. Thank you.
Gracias, Excelencia.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Tunisia.
Thank you, Madam President. My delegation would like to welcome the delegation of Sri Lanka, and we welcome the interest shown by this country, this fraternal country shows in the UPR. We note in particular the adoption of the National Human Rights Action Plan launched in 2011 with a view to implementing the recommendations adopted in 2008. Tunisia also notes the adoption in July 2012 of the action plan for the implementation of the recommendations of the Commission on Lessons Learned and Reconciliation. We would recommend that Sri Lanka step up the process of implementing these two action plans and that they fully cooperate with UN mechanisms in order to rapidly turn the page on the atrocities committed during the civil war. The participation of all stakeholders in these processes is of crucial importance, and therefore Tunisia recommends to Sri Lanka that it strengthen the capacity of its National Human Rights Commission, make it more independent, and bring it into line with the Paris Principles. In this connection, we would urge Sri Lanka to encourage the participation of all components of civil society in the promotion and protection of human rights. Tunisia encourages Sri Lanka to step up its efforts to combat all acts of torture and ill treatment, and we recommend that Sri Lanka consider the possibility of ratifying the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture and also ratifying the Statutes of Rome. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you very much. Turkey.
Thank you, Madam President. We would like to thank the distinguished delegation of Sri Lanka for their substantive presentation of their national report. Turkey welcomes the efforts of Sri Lanka to consolidate the hard-won peace following the defeat of terrorism and to ensure rapid development and reconciliation amongst the people of Sri Lanka. Provincial council elections that were held in the eastern province are particularly important for the consolidation of democracy, as the people of Sri Lanka exercise their fundamental right in the areas formerly threatened by the terrorist groups. We are cognizant that the need for economic development is fundamental for the effective realization of human rights. In this vein, we are pleased to note that the post-conflict economic growth rate of nearly 25% in the northern province, increasing its share in the national economy. Sri Lanka's continuous efforts to resettle the vast amount of IDPs deserves appreciation. The implementation of a special program of work to resolve the land disputes in the northern and eastern provinces and priority given in favor of the IDPs are worth recognizing as a part of reconciliation efforts. Turkey appreciates and encourages Sri Lanka's active engagement with the main human rights bodies as a part of 7 core international conventions and 4 optional protocols. Turkey, however, appreciates the existing moratorium on executions and recommends the ratification of the 2nd optional protocol to ICCPR. Turkey also recommends the ratification of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities.
Gracias. Le doy el uso de la palabra.
Thank you. I now call upon Uganda.
Thank you, Madam President. Uganda congratulates the delegation of Sri Lanka led by the Honorable Minister for a comprehensive report. Uganda has carefully read the report of Sri Lanka's National Reconciliation Mechanisms, Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, as well as the government's plan of action to implement the report's recommendations. It is clear that the government of Sri Lanka is committed to addressing in a phased and planned manner the said recommendations. We single out the monies devoted to post-conflict development work and measures to safeguard the human rights of those affected by the 30 years conflict. We also note the visit of the OHCHR team to Sri Lanka at the latter's invitation and facilitation. We further note the promotion and protection of the rights of the women and the creation of National Child Protection Authority. Finally, we recommend that Sri Lanka continues addressing accountability issues and the implementation of the LRRC as planned. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam President. Ukraine welcomes the esteemed delegation of Sri Lanka to the 2nd UPR cycle and thanks for a comprehensive introductory statement as well as for the informative national report that reflects Sri Lanka's adherence to the review process. We note with satisfaction positive developments in the country since 2008 and the efforts taken by the government of Sri Lanka for implementation of recommendations accepted during the 1st UPR cycle, in particular through realization of the National Plan of Action for the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights. We encourage Sri Lanka to ensure successful implementation of the plan in all its thematic areas. Regarding accountability issues, Ukraine recommends Sri Lanka to strengthen efforts to investigate allegations of serious violations of international humanitarian law and the international human rights during the conflict and to hold those responsible to account. I thank you, Madam President.
Gracias.
Thank you. The United Arab Emirates. Thank you, Madam President. First of all, I would like to welcome the delegation from Sri Lanka. We thank them for the report that has been submitted to us, and this in particular involves all the stakeholders in the country, which has made this report even more credible. Madam President, 3 decades of devastating conflict have been overcome by Sri Lankan efforts, which has enabled this country to find a way out of the spiral of violence and instability. The efforts made by Sri Lanka have been taken on board by UNDP, which has put in its human development report that Sri Lanka has achieved a human development index of 0.691. In conclusion, we'd like to know what measures have been taken by Sri Lanka to ensure the return of displaced persons, the guarantee of repatriation of people who can still go back to their homes, or the compensation given to these people on a satisfactory basis. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Gracias.
Thank you, United Kingdom. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President, and we too welcome the Minister to the Human Rights Council. We also welcome the progress made in normalising the situation in Sri Lanka since 2009. People's daily lives are now free from the scourges of terrorism and of war. The LLRC report provides a valuable framework to address wider post-conflict issues. We support swift implementation of its recommendations, and we urge the government to take these and further measures towards long-term reconciliation and human rights protection, in line with this Council's resolution. We're deeply concerned about attacks on and intimidation of journalists, human rights defenders and legal professionals. We call on the government to ensure no legal or political impunity for attacks, nor reprisals against any individual, including for cooperating with UN mechanisms. We have two recommendations: to fully and transparently investigate alleged grave breaches of international humanitarian law during the conflict, and to ensure a climate in which all citizens are able to freely express their opinions and beliefs without fear of reprisal or retribution, and to invite the Special Rapporteur on freedom of opinion and expression to visit.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Excellency. I give the floor now to the distinguished delegation of Australia.
Thank you, Madam President. Australia welcomes Sri Lanka's commitment to establish the processes and programs necessary to lead to improvements in the promotion and protection of human rights, including the National Action Plan for the Protection and Promotion of Human Rights 2011 to 2016 and the Lessons Learnt and Reconciliation Commission Action Plan. Australia agrees that it is now important for Sri Lanka to achieve measurable, concrete improvements as a result of implementing these plans. In particular, in the context of implementation of Sri Lanka's National Action Plan for the Protection and Promotion of Human Rights and the LLRC Action Plan, Australia makes the following recommendations to Sri Lanka. 1, to take action to reduce and eliminate all cases of abductions and disappearances. 2, to take action to reduce and eliminate all cases of abuse, torture or mistreatment by police and security forces. And 3, take action to facilitate greater participation by citizens and civil society in helping to implement human rights action plans. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Uruguay.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, Madam President. Uruguay welcomes the delegation of Sri Lanka and wishes to highlight the establishment of the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Committee as the beginning of a process, as also the adoption of the National Plan of Action for the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights. In combating impunity and preventing international crimes, Uruguay recommends acceding to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court and drafting a law on cooperation between the state and the International Criminal Court. Although the government of Sri Lanka has made progress in locating families following the conflict, the whereabouts of hundreds of disappeared children is still unknown. Uruguay recommends determining the whereabouts of the children whose fate is unknown, guaranteeing access to the north and the east of the country to humanitarian bodies, both international and local, with specific knowledge concerning programs for locating and reunited families, and calling upon the working group on enforced disappearance. We also recommend work on the elimination of the causes of recruitment of minors in camps for internally displaced persons, and for account to be taken of the language, cultural and religious diversity of Sri Lanka. Venezuela. Thank you, Madam President. We express our thanks for the presentation given by the illustrious delegation of Sri Lanka, and we appreciate the progress made by its government in complying with the recommendations of the UPR. We also welcome the implementation of the Charter on Women, which established the National Women's Committee, which maintains a centre for complaints. We recommend that the government provide training and also promote training amongst its institutions to guarantee the effective implementation of this important initiative. We welcome the adoption of the National Plan of Action for the Protection and Promotion of Human Rights. We recommend that the government of Sri Lanka broadly disseminate information on it, as also that it strengthen government agencies at the national, provincial and local levels to guarantee its full implementation. We also recommend strengthening the association between government agencies with the National Commission for Human Rights of Sri Lankan civil society for coordinating, planning and applying the National Agenda for Human Rights. Finally, we recommend that progress continue to be made in the application of the recommendations of the Mechanism for National Reconciliation, which was so rightly given impetus. Thank you very much. Vietnam.
President, the Vietnamese delegation warmly welcomes Minister Mahinda and acknowledges Sri Lanka's tireless efforts in achieving normalcy for all people, including the war victims, especially during the ongoing post-conflict national reconciliation and reconstruction, sharing with others the importance of a peaceful and stable environment for the holistic promotion and protection of human rights in Sri Lanka. We believe that continued strong national commitment and endeavour is even more needed. So is the spirit of dialogue and cooperation between Sri Lanka and the international community. Madam President, challenges facing Sri Lanka are of great magnitude. That scope can be truly daunting. Desired progress now depends heavily on Sri Lanka's systematic and concrete measures in translating her national action plan into reality, as well as on the seriousness with which Sri Lanka engages with the UN human rights mechanism. We wish Sri Lanka the best. I thank you.
Gracias. Zimbabwe.
Thank you. Zimbabwe Ambassador, you have the floor.
I thank you, Madam President. Madam President, Zimbabwe warmly welcomes the delegation of Sri Lanka and sincerely thanks them for the detailed national report. We are hopeful that the end of the conflict, coupled with the government's reconciliation programs, will enable Sri Lanka intensify its efforts in the promotion and protection of human rights of its people. We commend Sri Lanka for its efforts to domesticate core international human rights treaties to which it is a party through specific constitutional provisions and legislative instruments. We applaud Sri Lanka's constructive engagement and dialogue with UN human rights institutions and mechanisms. In this regard, we particularly note the invitation extended in 2011 to the High Commissioner for Human Rights to visit the country. Zimbabwe recommends that Sri Lanka consolidates its reconciliation efforts to ensure that durable peace prevails in the country. Zimbabwe also recommends that Sri Lanka accelerates capacity building in order to effectively implement the National Action Plan for the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights. Zimbabwe wishes the government and people of Sri Lanka well in all their endeavors. I thank you.
Gracias, Excelente.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Algeria.
Thank you, Madam President. We warmly welcome the distinguished delegation of Sri Lanka and thank His Excellency Mr. Samar Singhi for his insightful presentation. The engagement of Sri Lanka in the UPR process, as testified by the progress made since the first cycle, is commendable. We highly appreciate the efforts being made to achieve the MDGs, particularly halving extreme poverty by 2015, as well as to mainstream the MDGs as an essential component of the national development. We congratulate Sri Lanka for the conclusion of the UN objective of the UN Development Assistance Framework for 2013-2017. The Constitution of Sri Lanka contains provisions to promote the advancement of vulnerable groups of the society. We recommend that Sri Lanka intensify its policies and programs undertaking to ensure the protection of women and children. Finally, we wish the government of Sri Lanka all the success in the UPR process as well as in the implementation of the accepted recommendations. I thank you, Madam.
Gracias.
Thank you. Angola.
Thank you, Madam President. Allow me to welcome the delegation of Sri Lanka and thank for the report. The Republic of Angola notes the enormous challenges facing Sri Lanka as a post-conflict country in several areas, including the capacity building of human rights and promotion and protection. Angola commends the decision made by Sri Lankan government to establish a plan of action for the promotion and protection of human rights. Angola welcomes the commitment of the government of Sri Lanka, which led to the establishment of a working group to monitor the implementation of a report of the UN Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearance. We believe that those measures contribute to the strengthening, the promotion of human rights. Angola would like to offer two recommendations. First, strengthen the cooperation with the relevant human rights stakeholders, including the Human Rights Council. Second, continue the efforts to strengthening the capacity building of national institutions in the field of human rights promotion and protection. I thank you, Madam President.
Gracias.
Thank you. Argentina.
Gracias, señora Presidenta.
Thank you, Madam President. First of all, we welcome the delegation of Sri Lanka, headed by His Excellency Ambassador Samara Singhe, and thank him for presenting his report. Secondly, Argentina wishes to commend Sri Lanka for adopting the National Plan of Action for the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights. My delegation now wishes to make the following recommendations. 1. That it continue with the efforts to ratify the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons Against Enforced Disappearances. 2. That it continue with its efforts to combat impunity for serious human rights violations committed during the internal armed conflict. 3rd, that it enhance the measures to eliminate any discriminatory treatment on the grounds of sexual orientation or gender identity. 4th, we recommend, lastly, that Sri Lanka study the possibility of removing the death penalty from its legal regime. Thank you, United States of America. Madam Ambassador.
Madam President, the United States welcomes His Excellency Mr. Mahinda Samarasinghe and the Sri Lankan delegation. We note steps taken by the government of Sri Lanka to resettle IDPs, foster economic growth, improve infrastructure. Due to time constraints, we will provide full comments in writing at the back of the room and on our website. We remain concerned by the consolidation of executive power and that former conflict zones remain militarized. Serious human rights violations continue, including disappearances, torture, extrajudicial killings, and threats to freedom of expression. Bearing in mind these concerns, the United States makes the following recommendations. Number 1, implement the constructive recommendations of the LLRC, including removal of military from civilian functions, creation of mechanisms to address cases of the missing and detained, issuance of death certificates, land reform, devolution of power, and disarming paramilitaries. 2, transfer NGO oversight to a civilian institution and protect freedom of expression. 3, end impunity for human rights violations and fulfill legal obligations regarding accountability. 4, especially in light of today's news of the effort to impeach the Chief Justice, strengthen judicial independence by ending government interference with the judicial process, protecting members of the judiciary from attacks, and restoring a fair, independent, transparent.
Muchas gracias, Excelencia.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I now give the floor to Austria.
Thank you, Madam President. Austria welcomes His Excellency the Minister of Plantations. We acknowledge the adoption of the national action plans for the promotion and protection of human rights and on the LLRC recommendations. At its first UPR, Sri Lanka accepted recommendations on the protection of witnesses and victims of human rights violations, as well as on the protection of IDPs. Could you provide specific timelines for the full implementation? We welcome steps taken to facilitate the resettlement of IDPs, but we remain concerned about reports on security forces still occupying land belonging to IDPs, allegations regarding limitations of freedom of assembly and expression, and reports of rape and sexual assault committed against Tamil women and girls by members of the security forces in the country's north. Austria offers the following recommendations. Ratify the Rome Statute of the ICC, as well as OPCAT, and establish a national torture prevention mechanism. Fully implement the recommendations of the LLRC, in particular steps to ensure independent and effective investigations into all allegations of serious human rights violations in the context of Sri Lanka's civil war and its aftermath. Finally, adopt a national policy on the protection of human rights defenders and journalists to prevent harassment and intimidation and to ensure the effective investigation of such acts and prosecution of perpetrators. I thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Azerbaijan.
Thank you, Madam President. Welcome the delegation of Sri Lanka in the UPR and thank for its informative presentation. We are happy to see the end to this 30-year-long conflict in Sri Lanka and the measures taken to advance human rights and freedoms in the country, especially in the conflict-affected areas. We recommend Sri Lanka to continue its efforts in that regard. Sri Lanka has integrated the Millennium Development Goals onto the National Development Agenda. Among the notable achievements are those related to equitable primary education, maternal and child mortality, access to safe drinking water, and literacy. Sri Lanka is a party to 7 core human rights treaties, including ICCPR, CEDAW, CRC, and others. In similar way, we would like to ask whether the government is considering joining the conventions concerning the protection of refugees. We welcome the measures taken by the government concerning the resettlement of internal displaced persons, including the closure of the last IDP welfare village in the country. While being aware of the commitment of the government to addressing the remaining challenges of the returnees, we would recommend Sri Lanka to develop a comprehensive policy with regard to all aspects of internal displacement. Thank you for attention.
Gracias.
Thank you. Bahrain.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, I would like to welcome the delegation of Sri Lanka and to thank them for the valuable presentation that they have given the Council, and which underlines the attention that Sri Lanka is according to the strengthening and the protection of human rights despite difficulties. Madam, we have read very carefully the national report of Sri Lanka as well as other relevant reports and appreciate the valuable positive steps that have been taken by Sri Lanka to implement the recommendations that had been submitted during the first round of the UPR. My delegation pays tribute to the excellent efforts that have been made by the government of Sri Lanka to strengthen and to protect women's rights through the implementation of Law 34 to stop domestic violence, that was in 2005, in addition to strengthening its implementation, in addition to introduction of amendments to the Penal Code for sexual assault on women and children. We also pay tribute to the efforts made by Sri Lanka to increase international cooperation to stop trafficking in persons. My delegation would like to extend the following recommendations. First, to continue efforts to implement the national plan to strengthen and protect human rights, and to continue the implementation of those recommendations that have been accepted by the LLRC.
Gracias. Bangladesh.
Thank you. Bangladesh, Ambassador.
Madam President, we welcome the Honourable Minister of Sri Lanka. We sympathize with Sri Lanka as it struggles to come out of the scourges of terrorism and bring peace and reconciliation to its people. Given the enormity of the challenges, the progress made thus far cannot be ignored. Considering its socio-economic constraints, Sri Lanka needs to be given the time and space and assistance and cooperation by the international community to implement the domestic process of reconciliation. Underscoring the need for a homegrown political solution, we encourage Sri Lanka.
Gracias, Excelencia.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Belarus. Our delegation would like to extend a warm welcome to the delegation from Sri Lanka and thank it for presenting its national report. We very much commend the Sri Lankan government's commitment to the cause of promoting and protecting human rights. It is with regret that we note the unbalanced nature of the information prepared for the review by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. We also note the unjustifiably high level of interest shown by the Human Rights Council special procedures in the situation in Sri Lanka, whereas concerning other countries where there are systemic problems with ensuring human rights, which can be observed, these same special procedures do not even bother to send requests. Sri Lanka has reaffirmed its openness to engage in a human rights dialogue by sending an official invitation for a visit to the country to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. However, we have not seen any reactions from the Office of the High Commissioner in the documents to this invitation. There are definitely problems that exist, and the government is not attempting to hide them. At the same time, we see that it is geared towards working to resolving problems on the basis of constructive dialogue and cooperation. We wish Sri Lanka success in these endeavors. Thank you very much.
Gracias. Bélgica.
Thank you. Belgium. Madam President, Belgium would like to welcome the delegation from Sri Lanka, and we salute the positive actions taken by the Sri Lankan government to help displaced persons, and we would congratulate the government of Sri Lanka on adopting its LLRC report and its plan of action. However, my country would recommend that Sri Lanka Council special procedures in the situation in Sri Lanka, whereas concerning other countries where there are systemic problems with ensuring human rights, which can be observed, these same special procedures do not even bother to send requests. Sri Lanka has reaffirmed its openness to engage in a human rights dialogue by sending an official invitation for a visit to the country to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. However, we have not seen any reactions from the Office of the High Commissioner in the documents to this invitation. There are definitely problems that exist, and the government is not attempting to hide them. At the same time, we see that it is geared towards working to resolving problems on the basis of constructive dialogue and cooperation. We wish Sri Lanka success in these endeavors. Thank you very much.
Gracias. Bélgica.
Thank you. Belgium. Madam President, Belgium would like to welcome the delegation from Sri Lanka, and we salute the positive actions taken by the Sri Lankan government to help displaced persons, and we would congratulate the government of Sri Lanka on adopting its LLRC report and its plan of action. However, my country would recommend that Sri Lanka ensure the full, tangible implementation of the LLRC report and the national strategy as is planned for by the plan of action. How is the government concretely attacking the problem of abductions and forced disappearances? My government would recommend that the government undertake research and prosecution against the perpetrators of abductions, and that it strengthen the awareness of security services. Belgium would recommend that Sri Lanka ratify the Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances. Lastly, we'd recommend that Sri Lanka extend a standing invitation to the Special Rapporteurs of the United Nations and normalize its relations and cooperate with UN institutions in charge of human rights. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Gracias. Benin.
Thank you. Benin.
Micrófono, por favor.
Microphone for Benin, please.
La délégation du Bénin.
The delegation of Benin wishes to send a greeting to the delegation of Sri Lanka and thank them for presenting their second report. Benin notes with satisfaction the adoption and implementation by Sri Lanka of the National Human Rights Action Plan. The delegation of Benin encourages Sri Lanka in the measures taken to protect children, particularly those relating to rehabilitation of former child soldiers and returning them to their families, and also efforts to promote awareness and to repress with the utmost severity the recruitment of child soldiers. We also welcome all measures aimed at protecting the rights of displaced persons, to allow them to return and to have their property returned to them in accordance with international rules on the subject. Benin also appreciates the various areas of progress that Sri Lanka has made and recommends that Sri Lanka step up its efforts to promote greater enjoyment by the people of fundamental human rights. Lastly, the Republic of Benin would recommend that Sri Lanka maintain and strengthen its cooperation with the various United Nations system mechanisms and also cooperation with financial institutions in order to deal with the many challenges related to the reconstruction of peace and national reconciliation. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Bhutan.
Madam President, my delegation extends a warm welcome to the delegation of Sri Lanka led by His Excellency Mr. Mahendra Singha, the President's Special Envoy on Human Rights, to this session of the UPR Working Group. We thank the Honourable Minister for his comprehensive presentation of the National Report. Bhutan appreciates the significant measures taken by Sri Lanka to advance the human rights and fundamental freedoms of its citizens. In this regard, launching of the National Action Plan for the promotion and protection of human rights is highly commendable. We acknowledge the efforts to address the issue of land in the north and east of the country and recommend the government of Sri Lanka to continue measures underway to address land issues, including amending the prescription ordinance, whereby displaced landowners will be able to defeat the adverse claims based on the running of time. Madam President, Sri Lanka recently emerged from a long-drawn conflict. Peace building and reconstruction after such a protracted conflict takes time. In this regard, we hope the international community will extend its full cooperation.
Gracias.
Thank you, Your Excellency. The Plurinational State of Bolivia. Thank you, Madam President. The Plurinational State of Bolivia would like to extend the warmest possible welcome to the delegation of the Socialist Democratic Republic of Sri Lanka and thank them for presenting their report. We recognize with pleasure that Sri Lanka is on the verge of achieving MDG 6, which includes the eradication of extreme poverty and hunger. And also it is about to achieve universal primary education, promoting gender equality and empowerment of women, reducing child mortality, improving maternal health, combating HIV, AIDS, malaria and other diseases. Lastly, in the constructive spirit that characterizes this type of review, we'd like to recommend that the country continue working to achieve all of the Millennium Goals, which are a benchmark for redoubling efforts to ensure the effective protection of the human rights of millions of people who suffer and continue to live in extreme poverty throughout the world. Thank you, Madam President. Thank you. Botswana. Ambassador.
Madam President, Botswana warmly welcomes the delegation of Sri Lanka and thanks them for a comprehensive national report and presentation. We commend Sri Lanka for various measures taken, including the successful resettlement of program for the IDPs, extensive demining, progress on rehabilitation and reintegration, initiatives on housing and language policy, and general economic development. These achievements deserve recognition. Dialogue with the Council is also appreciated. Botswana also welcomes the plan for the implementation of recommendations of the LRC. We also note progress made thus far. This notwithstanding, could the government shed more light on what she proposes to do regarding accountability for allegations of serious violations of international human rights community, including relevant experiences, be sought for the implementation of the LLRC recommendations? I thank you.
Gracias, Excelencia.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Brazil.
Madam President, Brazil welcomes the delegation of Sri Lanka to the UPR. We recognize considerable improvements in the country since the end of the long-lasting conflict in the northern and eastern provinces. Brazil welcomes the progress in the resettlement of IDPs, such as the closure of the Menique farm camp. We commend the demining program. We welcome the national plans of action for the promotion and protection of human rights and the implementation of the or involuntary disappearances by inviting the working group to visit the country. Thank you.
Gracias. Brunei Darussalam.
Thank you. Brunei Darussalam.
And Brunei Darussalam would like to thank the delegation of Sri Lanka, led by Honorable Mahinda Samarsinghe, for the comprehensive presentation. We commend the efforts of the government of Sri Lanka for carrying out its obligations by coordinating and consulting all relevant stakeholders in the preparation of its national report. Brunei Darussalam notes Sri Lanka's commitment towards the promotion and protection of the rights for its people. We congratulate the government of Sri Lanka on the launching of the National Plan of Action for the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights in December 2011, which includes steps to advance the empowerment of women, women's rights, and gender equality. We would encourage Sri Lanka to continue its ongoing efforts to implement the NHRP for the benefit of all its citizens. Brunei Darussalam is encouraged by the ongoing efforts undertaken by the government of Sri Lanka towards the alleviation of poverty and achieving the MDGs by 2015, as well as upholding the rights of persons with disabilities. We welcome the measures taken to safeguard and advance the rights of children through its national mechanisms, such as the National Child Protection Authority. Brunei Darussalam appreciates Sri Lanka's continued cooperation with the United Nations and its mechanisms to further promote and protect the rights of its people. Finally, we encourage Sri Lanka to maintain the good momentum of this constructive approach. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Burkina Faso.
Madam President, Burkina Faso congratulates Sri Lanka on the presentation of its report, and would like to thank the delegation for the oral presentation made and the updates given. Since the submission of its first report, Sri Lanka has undertaken noteworthy positive action in the implementation of the recommendations. Burkina Faso notes with interest the creation of a Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, legislative and constitutional reforms, and also the adoption of a National Human Rights Action Plan. Burkina Faso recommends that Sri Lanka continue these efforts in implementing the action plan. Although party to many international human rights instruments, a considerable number of the instruments which guarantee individual freedoms and collective rights have not been ratified by Sri Lanka, as is indeed mentioned in the compilation drawn up by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Burkina Faso would therefore encourage Sri Lanka to look into this matter and to consider ratification of those instruments. Lastly, my delegation recommends that Sri Lanka fully cooperate with the other UN human rights mechanisms. We wish the country every success in the future human rights activities. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Cambodia, Ambassador.
Thank you, Madam President. Cambodia wishes to extend our warmest welcome to the delegation of Sri Lanka and thanks the Honorable Minister Mahinda for his presentation of the national report at this session. We recognize the effort currently undertaken by the government of Sri Lanka to address all the challenges post conflict period. The launching of the National Human Rights Action Plan in 2011 clearly demonstrates the government's commitment to the promotion and protection of human rights in the country. We are pleased to learn that Sri Lanka is being on track to achieve most of the target of MDG. We take note of the appreciation of notable progress made by the government of Sri Lanka on the mining in the identified areas. Cambodia therefore encouraged the government of Sri Lanka to make further effort to fully complete the demining process as early as possible. We also recommended to Sri Lanka to make further effort to ratify all the relevant international instruments that are vital to the promotion and protection of human rights in keeping with its national capacity and priority. We wish Sri Lanka all the success in its future endeavor.
Gracias, Excelencia.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Canada.
Thank you, Madam President. Canada recommends that Sri Lanka, 1, repeal Sections 9.1 and 15A1 of the Prevention of Terrorism Act to ensure that detainees are held only in recognized places of detention, with regularized procedures and safeguards to protect detainees, including access to legal representation and systematic notification to families of detainee whereabouts. 2, create a mechanism to ensure that all internally displaced persons, including 66,151 quote-unquote old IDPs, and further 103,274 living with host communities, receive a written statement detailing their entitlements and plans to return to their original home.
That are vital to the promotion and protection of human rights in keeping with its national capacity and priority. We wish Sri Lanka all the success in its future endeavor.
Gracias, Excelencia.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Canada.
Thank you, Madam President. Canada recommends that Sri Lanka, 1, repeal Sections 9.1 and 15A1 of the Prevention of Terrorism Act to ensure that detainees are held only in recognized places of detention, with regularized procedures and safeguards to protect detainees, including access to legal representation and systematic notification to families of detainee whereabouts. 2, create a mechanism to ensure that all internally displaced persons, including 66,151 quote-unquote old IDPs, and further 103,274 living with host communities, receive a written statement detailing their entitlements and plans to return to their original homes. 3, expedite implementation of reconciliation measures in the North. This would include removing oversight of humanitarian and NGO activities from the purview of the Ministry of Defense to a civilian body, reducing the intrusiveness of military presence on civilian life in the North, and setting a specific date for free and fair Northern Provincial Council elections. 4, criminalize consenting homosexual relationships between persons over the age of consent by repealing Section 365A of the Penal Code. A question. Well, thank you, Madam President.
Gracias.
Thank you. Chile, Ambassador, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Madam President. We'd like to extend a warm welcome to the delegation of Sri Lanka. We thank them for the comprehensive presentation by Minister Samara Singh, and we welcome the resettlement of about 300,000 displaced and internally displaced persons. We would like to say that considering that the government is now doing its utmost to resettle these people, we'd recommend that they intensify their efforts to ensure that displaced persons can return to their places of origin, compensating them when it is not possible. We welcome the efforts to tackle the question of disappearances. We would like to say that considering that the working group on enforced disappearances is cooperating with Sri Lanka on the subject, we'd recommend that they accept the request for a visit put forward by that body. We welcome the government's commitment to investigating and punishing complaints of extrajudicial summary or arbitrary executions. Therefore, we'd recommend that all necessary measures be taken to bring to trial and punish perpetrators of violations of international law and international human rights law, and we'll also call that they continue working with the LLRC and implement its decisions. Thank you very much. Thank you, Your Excellency. The People's Republic of China.
Madam President, the Chinese delegation wishes to welcome His Excellency Minister Singhara and his delegation to the review. It fully demonstrates the importance the government of Sri Lanka attaches to the review. China wishes to congratulate and commend Sri Lanka for the major achievements in social and economic development and international reconciliation. We have taken note that Sri Lanka has published the National Action Plan for Protection and Promotion of Human Rights and is actively engaged in the implementation of the LRC recommendations and has made positive progress in resettling IDPs and recovering the economy in a affected areas. Furthermore, the government has made a remarkable achievement in poverty alleviation. China calls on the international community to recognize the specific conditions and difficulties facing the country, to give Sri Lanka adequate time, space and constructive support in its national reconciliation. China recommends the government of Sri Lanka remains committed to the sustainable economic and social development and further promote national reconciliation and achieve stability and development in the country. Thank you, Madam President.
Muchas gracias, Excelencia.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Congo. Thank you, Madam President. The delegation of the Republic of Congo greets the delegation from Sri Lanka and congratulates His Excellency, the Minister of Industry, for the high-quality information made available to the Council. Congo notes with satisfaction all of the progress achieved by the country since the first cycle of the Universal Periodic Review, and in particular the adoption of an official plan to implement recommendations through the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, with its main pillars of work being mine clearance, resettlement and reintegration of displaced persons, as well as an overhaul of the educational system. My delegation would like to congratulate the government of Sri Lanka for all the efforts made to rebuild the regions of the north and east, to get the economy going again, the rebuilding of basic infrastructure and the reorganization of civil administration. All of these positive actions to enhance the well-being of the people deserve to be supported by the international community. Besides presenting reports to various treaty bodies, Sri Lanka has cooperated closely with the mandate holders so as to strengthen national mechanisms. Congo would encourage the government of Sri Lanka to hold firm to its efforts to promote national reconciliation and to create a legal framework which is favorable for the economic and social development of the country. Thank you. Thank you. Costa Rica Ambassador.
Thank you, Madam President. Costa Rica greets the representatives of Sri Lanka and thanks them for submitting their report. For Costa Rica, as for Sri Lanka, the Universal Periodic Review is an exercise in cooperation for the promotion and defense of human rights, and for this reason we commend its willingness for dialogue and openness. Costa Rica understands that Sri Lanka is still in a process of transition and has been so since a lengthy period of violence and civil war. We support all the efforts made by the government to heal the wounds of the past and to try and turn the page. However, we continue to be concerned that today human rights defenders are still being persecuted. Furthermore, ethnic minorities are still being discriminated against, and there are also allegations of torture. My delegation wishes to make two recommendations. One, to allow the International Committee of the Red Cross unrestricted access to detention centers. Two, to accede to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Thank you very much. Thank you. Cuba.
We'd like to extend a warm welcome to the delegation of Sri Lanka and thank them for the information provided. Sri Lanka today is a stable, united, forward-looking country. It has a constitutional government as well as a vibrant democracy like any other independent nation. It has attained peace and social tranquility, doing away with the manifestations of terrorism that afflicted it in the past. We would congratulate the government on its undeniable progress in implementing the recommendations accepted in 2008. We'd also congratulate them on the process of rehabilitation and reintegration of the ex-combatants of the LTTE, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, and in particular the approach taken by the authorities of not subjecting to judicial procedures children who participated as combatants in the conflict, as well as the swift resettlement of displaced persons. Cuba would recommend that the country continue assisting the ex-combatants of the LTTE through support schemes. Second, that it share with the international community its experiences in the rehabilitation and reintegration of the ex-combatant children of the LTTE. And third, that it continue providing assistance to displaced persons who have returned, in particular in the form of accommodation, life support systems and other economic possibilities. Thank you very much. Thank you. Cyprus.
Thank you, Madam President. Cyprus welcomes Sri Lanka's participation in the second cycle of the UPR. We have carefully studied the national report of Sri Lanka and we would like to acknowledge the positive steps taken by the government in the areas of development, poverty reduction, rehabilitation, reintegration of the National Action Plan for the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights, and the recent establishment of a specialized task force for the implementation of the LLRC recommendations. Admittedly, a number of challenges remain. In this regard, we encourage the government of Sri Lanka, 1, to redouble its efforts against impunity and to strengthen the draft bill on witness and victim protection. 2,
to effectively address the problem of the significant number of outstanding cases of missing persons through effective institutional coordination investigation. 3, to continue adopting specific measures and action plans to combat human trafficking. And 4, to consider ratifying OPCAT, second optional protocol to ICCPR and the CED. I thank you, Madam President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Czech Republic.
The Czech Republic welcomes the delegation of Sri Lanka to the UPR. We thank for the comprehensive report and recognize the efforts of the government, as well as a number of challenges remaining in the crucial processes of reconciliation and strengthening of the rule of law. With regard to the protection against torture and ill treatment, and based on our own positive experience with the OPCAT, we would like to recommend Sri Lanka to accede to it and to adopt further measures to prevent torture and ill treatment, in particular in prison and detention centers. Finally, we would like the delegation to elaborate more on the situation of human rights defenders, and we would like to recommend adoption of a national policy to provide them with protection and ensure investigation and punishment of threats or attacks against them. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. My delegation welcomes the delegation of Sri Lanka led by His Excellency Minister Mahinda Samarasinghe and the introduction of informative report by the delegation. The DPRK commends the achievements made by Sri Lanka, including integration of the Millennium Development Goals into the National Development Agenda, achieving equitable primary education, reduced maternal and child mortality, and access to safe drinking water by the population. We wish the government of Sri Lanka all the best in furtherance of its positive continue human rights education for police and security forces to ensure better protection and maintenance of human rights standards. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Denmark, Mr. Ambassador.
Madam President, we appreciate the Sri Lanka government's national plan of action for the promotion and protection of human rights and the action plan to implement the LRC recommendations. These should be fully implemented as soon as possible. Denmark has two recommendations. First, that the Sri Lanka government conducts impartial investigations and prosecutions against all members of the security forces, regardless of rank, that are implicated in violations of human rights and international humanitarian law, including sexual violence. Second, that the government grants due process rights to all detainees held in both military and police facilities, including those held in administrative detentions. This closes all unofficial detention sites and facilitates effective and independent monitoring of detainees. We are concerned over the continued reports of impunity for perpetrators of serious human rights violations and regrets that the Sri Lanka government is yet to implement several previously accepted UPR recommendations, including on extrajudicial killings and torture. We would appreciate an update on the status of the government's deliberations on ratifying the OPCAT since Sri Lanka's last UPR. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you, Your Excellency. The distinguished delegation of Sri Lanka has asked for the floor, and I am only too pleased to give the floor now to Minister Samarasinghe or to a member of his delegation.
No, thank you, Mr. Minister, Madam President, and members of the Council. May I straight away deal with the issue of accountability. As a member of, as the Vice Chairman of the Task Force for the implementation of the LLRC recommendations, I can tell you that it is perhaps a factual inaccuracy to observe that the LLRC was falling short of the of achieving the standards that are required for the purposes of examining the issue of accountability. It is important to note that while the report states that there was no preconceived policies to target civilians and the protection of civilian life was a key factor, the LLRC said, in the formulation of policy for military operations, the LLRC nonetheless concluded that there is evidence that warrants investigation. Now, that didn't stop there. The task force did make recommendations to the authorities, and you'll be pleased to learn that the Army commander convened a board of inquiry to study the LLRC recommendations as recommended by the task force. Surprisingly, the Army came up with identified 56 incidents in the report and made the 56 recommendations be gone into, and he convened a court of inquiry in terms of the Army regulations, headed by a Major General and six senior officers, to go into those matters in detail. The Court of Inquiry has commenced the proceedings. Investigations are in progress. There have been 50 sittings of that court up to now, as we speak, so to speak, answers examined by this Court of Inquiry, and what were they going into. Let me very quickly tell you what they are going into. The first thing they are going into is civilian casualties, as recognized by the LLRC. The first question they asked themselves, were any attacks made by the Army or its members on civilians with a view to causing them harm and damage in a deliberate and intentional manner? Now, isn't that accountability? The second question, if the answer to the above is in the affirmative, they wanted the Court of Inquiry to identify locations, identify dates, identify details of such incidents, the number of civilian casualties, who were wounded and who received fatal injuries. Then they were asked to ask the question, were such actions deliberate? Were they intentional with a view to causing civilian casualties? Were they within the rules of proportionality? Were they in relation to legitimate military targets? Now, the next question they've asked is if civilian casualties had resulted from any deliberate and/or intentional act, was it in excess of the rules of proportionality? And they were asked to make recommendations with regard to persons responsible for such civilian casualties and recommend measures to avoid such occurrences in the future. Madam President, in addition to that, they were also asked to go into the question of Channel 4. So there is a comprehensive, wide mandate that has been given to the Court of Inquiry that I'm confident that would satisfy the international community on matters of accountability. Can I very quickly say a word about a few observations that were made, I believe, by Canada, with regard to the prevention of terrorism law. I really wish, and I really sincerely believe, that we penalties and recommend measures to avoid such occurrences in the future. Madam President, in addition to that, they were also asked to go into the question of Channel 4. So there is a comprehensive, wide mandate that has been given to the Court of Inquiry that I'm confident that would satisfy the international community on matters of accountability. And I really sincerely believe that we can not only remove Section 9, but remove the entirety of the Prevention of Terrorism Act. If only terrorism was no longer a scourge to humanity on this planet. I don't think we have reached that stage yet, and I'm fairly sure that there are terrorists all over the world, and we hear a lot of saber-rattling even as of today. Are we to be complacent with terrorism? Are we satisfied that terrorism is no more, or do we resort to legislation of a particular kind to deal with it? I'm fairly sure that the reason for a prevention of terrorism law in any part of the world is to demonstrate to those of them who wish to resort to terrorism that the civilized world is in no mood to create nurseries for terrorists all over the world. Now, just to say one more word with regard to those of them who are differently sexually oriented, we have taken note of that particular observation made. So therefore, Madam President, I can, perhaps being in the task force, tell you with every confidence that we are moving in the right direction, we are looking at the right things, and we are confident that we can raise Sri Lanka to that land in which we people can live in peace and dignity. Thank you.
I'm very grateful for the replies provided. Let us return to the interactive dialogue. I now give the floor to the delegation of Djibouti.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, Djibouti warmly welcomes the Sri Lankan delegation and welcomes the presentation of their national report for the second cycle of the UPR. We take note of the progress made, the difficulties encountered, and also projects underway to promote and protect human rights and fundamental freedoms in this country. We'd like to make 3 recommendations through the interactive dialogue. First recommendation, strengthening efforts made to include human rights education and peace education in school curricula. Our second recommendation, Sri Lanka needs to tackle the problem of a shortage of housing by adopting a national strategy and an action plan for housing. Third recommendation, continue efforts to promote access by persons with disabilities to the labour market by strengthening the system of jobs reserved for persons with disability. Finally, we recommend the international community support Sri Lanka in the effective implementation of the recommendations that will emerge from this dialogue. Thank you, Madam President.
Gracias.
Thank you. Ecuador. Thank you, Madam President. The delegation of Ecuador greets and welcomes the delegation of Sri Lanka and thanks it for its presentation to this Council. We consider the information provided significant, particularly concerning the measures adopted by the government of Sri Lanka to establish responsibilities for violations of human rights, which includes a subsequent investigation of pending cases and the creation of fact-finding committees. Ecuador recognizes how complex investigative processes are and consequently the need for adequate time to be given for this work. Ecuador also welcomes the establishment of the Interministerial Working Group, which will have the task of checking on cases of alleged disappearances and handing over those answers from Sri Lanka concerning recent cases brought to its attention by the Working Group on enforced and involuntary disappearances. Ecuador welcomes the drafting of a new education policy by the Sri Lankan government and encourages it to renew its efforts to implement an ongoing improvement in education, including in human rights and peace education as part of the curriculum. Ecuador recommends that the death penalty be abolished, that it continue to provide cooperation concerning enforced or involuntary disappearances and cooperate with that group, and also that it continue with the proceedings underway. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ecuador. Egypt.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, my delegation welcomes the distinguished delegation of Sri Lanka headed by His Excellency Mr. Mahinda Samarasinghe, the Minister of Plantation Industries. Egypt is aware of the difficulties Sri Lanka has gone through and the challenges related to conflict and post-conflict transition vis-à-vis the promotion and protection of human rights. We emphasize the imperative of ensuring the unity and territorial integrity of Sri Lanka. Meanwhile, we pay particular attention to continuing national efforts in the field of human rights and fundamental freedoms. We note the positive developments in Sri Lanka since the end of hostilities, particularly efforts exerted in resettling IDPs, reducing security restrictions, combating recruitment of child soldiers, and holding elections in the eastern provinces. We welcome the decision of the government to lift the state of emergency and other time-mapped efforts to implement the recommendations of the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission report, in addition to policies and legislation introduced within the framework of the National Human Rights Plan. Finally, we would like to present the following recommendations to the government of Sri Lanka. To implement the announced voluntary commitments and the UPR accepted recommendations, to take further steps to ensure more participation of Sri Lankan Muslims in the reconciliation process and national efforts of economic, social and cultural integration, and to ratify the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and continue steps taken to domesticate other
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Estonia.
Thank you, Madam President. Estonia welcomes the delegation of Sri Lanka to the 14th session of the UPR. We thank Sri Lanka for their work in preparing the report presented earlier and also for the additional information given. However, we have to note that consultations with civil society have been modest and the report does not fully reflect the human rights situation in the country. First, Estonia welcomes Sri Lanka's National Action Plan for Human Rights and the National Action Plan for the implementation of the recommendations of the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission and the recommendations already implemented. However, we underline that all the recommendations of the LLRC and past commissions of inquiry need to be fully implemented. Second, Estonia is concerned about the fundamental freedoms of the people of Sri Lanka, such as freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and internet freedom. Estonia makes two most urgent recommendations to Sri Lanka. First, to hold accountable all persons who are liable for the violation of human rights and humanitarian law, and second, to accede to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, the ICC. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Excelencia.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Ethiopia.
Thank you, Madam President. Ethiopia welcomes the delegation of Sri Lanka led by Honorable Envoy of the President on Human Rights, and note with appreciation the progress made by the government of Sri Lanka for a sustainable political engagement in the country. We welcome the national plan of the government. My delegation would also like to recommend the government of Sri Lanka to disseminate the national action plan for the promotion and protection of human rights amongst the general population in local language so as to ensure a wider participation in the implementation process, thereby empowering claim holders in asserting protecting their rights. Finally, commending the launching of the trilingual policy of the government of Sri Lanka, we would like to recommend the government of Sri Lanka to further strengthen the capacity within the public institutions to enable the effective implementation of the trilingual policy. I thank you, Madam President.
Gracias.
Thank you. Finland.
Thank you, Madam President. Finland wishes to thank Mr. Minister and his delegation for the presentation of the national report today. During its previous UPR in 2008, Sri Lanka committed itself to complete the process of drafting a bill on the rights of IDPs. Finland has also taken note of the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission's report, which includes recommendations regarding IDPs. Finland is encouraged by the positive steps taken in the return process of the IDPs. However, Finland would be interested in hearing more about measures to take to protect the rights of the IDPs. Finland makes the following two recommendations. 1. Ensure the protection of IDPs' rights to voluntary and safe return to adequate restitution by inter alia, putting in place and implementing long-term housing and property restitution policies that comply with international standards. 2. Ensure women's participation in the post-conflict reconstruction and peace-building process. I thank you, Madam President.
Gracias.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I now give the floor to France, Mr. Ambassador.
Madame la Présidente. Thank you, Madam President. France recognizes the few areas of progress in the human rights area that have been made since the end of the conflict in Sri Lanka, but my country is still very concerned by the overall human rights situation in this country. We'd encourage Sri Lanka to do more to combat impunity. France recalls that in August 2006, 17 humanitarian workers of Action Against Hunger were brutally murdered in Mutur. This massacre is the worst crime ever committed against an NGO. And yet no prosecutions have taken place 6 years after the event. France would make the following recommendations to Sri Lanka. First of all, Sri Lanka rapidly implement the recommendations of the LLRC. 2. Create a credible investigatory mechanism for the Mutur murders, consisting of independent professional investigators, leading to the soonest identification, arrest and prosecution of the perpetrators. 3. Create an independent mechanism to look into the issue of missing persons with its own unique database. 4. Publish the names and place of detention of all persons in prison. 5. Accede to the Convention on Forced Disappearances. 6. Extend an invitation to the Working Group on Forced Disappearances. Thank you.
Excelencia, le soy uso la palabra.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Germany, Mr. Ambassador. Microphone.
El micrófono está roto, debe usar el... Ah, está perfecto.
Madam President, I'm sorry. Sri Lanka's national report is encouraging, Mr. Minister. Let me underline the vital importance of an independent judiciary and impeachment procedure to be conducted with utter diligence. Germany recommends first, please continue implementing the recommendations of the LLRC report and the report of the panel of experts in accordance with Human Rights Council Resolution 19-2. Second, take all steps to strengthen and ensure the independence of the National Human Rights Commission. Third, to immediately establish a publicly accessible central register for all persons missing or in custody, and fourth, to adopt the draft bill on witness and victim protection. I thank you, Madam President.
Gracias, Excelencia. La Santa Sede.
Thank you, Excellency, Holy See.
Thank you, Madam President. The Holy See welcomes the delegation of Sri Lanka. The national report highlights Sri Lanka's multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual, and multicultural character, as well as the significant work made to promote and protect peace and human rights in the country. My delegation appreciates Sri Lanka's accomplishments. It wishes to present the following recommendation for consideration by Sri Lanka. 1. To take measures to guarantee full protection of children's human rights by rehabilitating the ex-combatants and eliminating and reducing, among others, child trafficking, child sexual abuse, and violence against children. Second, to ensure legal ownership and return or restitution of houses and lands to internally displaced persons according to international standards. 3, to promote national reconciliation, taking into account and protecting Sri Lanka's ethnic and religious pluralism, ensuring that all religious denominations are granted equal treatment and enjoy their fundamental rights. And fourth, to accelerate the improvement of the judicial, police, military, and prison systems in line with the international human rights standards, and to investigate all allegations of extrajudicial, summary, or arbitrary killings and enforced disappearances and follow up according to justice requirements. Thank you, Madam President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. India, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Madam President. India welcomes several encouraging developments reported by Sri Lanka, such as resettlement of IDPs, rehabilitation of ex-combatants, and demining of land and reconstruction in the northern province. We look forward to speedy resolution of the residual issues in resettlement and rehabilitation. We recall the commitments made by Sri Lanka on the implementation of the 13th Amendment and building on it to achieve a meaningful devolution package. We urge expeditious action to take forward the political process for early political settlement. We have noted the announcement on holding provincial council elections in the northern province in 2013. We urge that the people of the province be able to exercise the democratic rights guaranteed by the Constitution as early as feasible. We look forward to the implementation of the constructive recommendations of the LLRC report. These include early progress towards reconciliation, promotion of a trilingual policy, reduction of high security zones, return of private land with the military, and phasing out of the security forces from civilian activities in the northern province. We call for credible investigations into allegations of human rights violations and loss of civilian life brought out in the LLRC report. We have noted the action plan for time-bound implementation of the LLRC recommendations. We believe that early and visible progress in this will foster genuine reconciliation. India will continue to remain engaged in assisting Sri Lanka in its resettlement and rehabilitation efforts for IDPs in Sri Lanka and in reconstruction activity. Thank you, Madam President.
Gracias.
Thank you. Indonesia.
Thank you, Madam President. My delegation warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of Sri Lanka and appreciates their comprehensive report. Indonesia commends Sri Lanka for their strong determination for peace and solid commitment to the promotion and protection of human rights in the country. Despite enormous human rights and humanitarian challenges encountered in the post-30 years of conflict situation, we are encouraged by Sri Lanka's continued progress in ensuring the betterment of every and each Sri Lankan population. Madam President, Indonesia is of the view that Sri Lanka continued transparency and engagement with international community is essential to enable sustained progress in the overall situation of the country. We therefore recommend Sri Lanka to continue its constructive engagement and cooperation with the international human rights mechanism, including through technical cooperation. Recommendation of RRC, including on accountability process through Sri Lanka National Action Plan of Human Rights and other relevant mechanisms. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Islamic Republic of Iran, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Madam President. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. My delegation welcomes the delegation of Sri Lanka headed by His Excellency Mr. Mahinda Samarasinghe, Minister for Plantation, and thanks them for presenting the informative and comprehensive report. Madam President, Sri Lanka is now a stable, united, and forward-looking country. We commend the government and people of Sri Lanka for their considerable achievements in restoration of civil administration, infrastructure, and economic development in the north and east of the country affected by by the internal conflict. Madam President, my delegation would like to make the following recommendations to be considered by the government of Sri Lanka. 1. Continue its efforts in launching the National Plan of Action for the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights. 2. Increase its endeavors in promotion of equity in economic development, poverty eradication, eliminating regional disparities, and guaranteeing equality of opportunity for all Sri Lankan citizens. 3. Carry on its measures in the implementation of the Act on Prevention of Domestic Violence as a means to improve and protect the rights of women. 4. Increase its efforts on strengthening protection of children's rights in such areas as child achievements in restoration of civil administration, infrastructure, and economic development in the north and east of the country affected by the internal conflict. Madam President, my delegation would like to make the following recommendations to be considered by the government of Sri Lanka. 1. Continue its efforts in launching the National Plan of Action for the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights. 2. Increase its endeavors in promotion of equity in economic development, poverty eradication, eliminating regional disparities, and guaranteeing equality of opportunity for all Sri Lankan citizens. 3. Carry on its measures in the implementation of the Act on Prevention of Domestic Violence as a means to improve and protect the rights of women. 4. Increase its efforts on strengthening protection of children's rights in such areas as child labor, domestic violence, trafficking, and sexual exploitation. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Iraq.
شكرا سيدتي الرئيس. يرحب وفد بلادي برئيس وعض.
Thank you. My country's delegation wishes to welcome the delegation of Sri Lanka, and we thank it for its report, which clearly shows the will of Sri Lanka to improve the human rights situation there. We praise the measures taken to adopt the 5-year National Action Plan for Human Rights, and we also welcome its accession to all human rights treaties and conventions, particularly the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We call upon Sri Lanka to ratify the International Convention on the protection of all persons against enforced disappearances, to ratify the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Thank you. Thank you very much. Sri Lanka has asked me to take the floor now. Please go ahead.
Madam President, just 2 questions that I want to quickly respond to. One was a reference to the judiciary, both by the United States as well as Germany. May I state for the record, Madam President, that impeachment of a judge is provided for in the Constitution of Sri Lanka. And what has to take place is that 1/3 of the members of Parliament has to sign a petition with valid grounds for impeachment, and this has to be handed over to the Speaker of the House of Parliament, after which a select committee of Parliament is established from members of Parliament of both sides of the House. So it's not only government members of Parliament who would look at these grounds, but also opposition members of Parliament. And a motion then has to be adopted by Parliament by a majority of parliamentarians voting for that motion. It is only after that that impeachment is possible. So I can assure the Ambassador of Germany, who referred to it a little while ago, that due process will be followed and valid grounds have to be established if an impeachment is to be put into place. The other very quick question that I want to respond to is about elections, which India addressed in their short statement. Yes, we do want to give democratic rights to the people of the North. In fact, out of 34 local government authorities that are set up in the North, 32 have already been elected. And we have gone on record saying that in 2013, the Provincial Council will be held. We have, in fact, even gone to the extent of incorporating this in our national report. So I want to assure the Indian delegation that this would also be implemented in the future. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, señor.
Thank you very much, Minister. Let us continue with our list. The distinguished delegation of Ireland.
Thank you, Madam President. Ireland welcomes the Sri Lankan delegation led by the Honourable Minister and thanks them for the presentation of the comprehensive national report this afternoon. Ireland commends Sri Lanka on the progress in implementing commitments made during the first UPR held in May 2008. The national report points to Sri Lanka's multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual and multicultural character. Ireland urges Sri Lanka to accept the support, friendship and encouragement of the international community, as exemplified by the Office of the High Commissioner and by the role of the Human Rights Council in strengthening and healing this fabric and building a strong human rights bedrock. Ireland urges Sri Lanka to allow remaining detainees to be either tried or to begin a process of reintegration as a way forward. Ireland is further concerned about the operational Prevention Against Terrorism Act, and particularly legal safeguards which are in place for persons suspected or charged on the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Furthermore, we urge full respect for the independence of the judiciary. Thank the Minister for his comments this afternoon on this issue, but do share also the concern expressed regarding reports relating to the impeachment of the Chief Justice. Finally, Ireland recommends that the Government of Sri Lanka take the necessary steps to ensure that all detainees are afforded a fair trial within a reasonable period. We also recommend the Government of Sri Lanka inform the Human Rights Council as part of the reporting process outlined in the national report of implementation of LLRC recommendations. Thank you, Madam President.
Muchas gracias, Excellencia.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Italy.
Thank you, Madam President. We welcome the distinguished delegation of Sri Lanka. Since the first review cycle, progress achieved in dealing with IDPs and reintegration of ex-combatants are encouraging. We also welcome the de facto moratorium on the death penalty in the country. Italy recommends the Sri Lankan authorities to seriously consider the possibility to abolish capital punishment. Sri Lanka is a country rich in cultural and religious pluralism. Italy recommends Sri Lanka to step up efforts to protect freedom of religion and promote interreligious dialogue as a tool to foster tolerance and peaceful coexistence. Several human rights concerns still remain, though, while noting the efforts already carried out by Colombo as part of the ongoing reconciliation process, Italy recommends that Sri Lanka continues to prioritize the rehabilitation and reintegration of former child soldiers, enforce disappearances, cases of torture, harassment of journalists, restrictions to freedom of expression and the independent media, and impunity for human rights violations continued.
Thank you. Japan. Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Madam President. Japan welcomes the formulation and announcement of the National Action Plan for the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights, as well as the National Plan of Action to implement the recommendations of the LLRC, setting out a concrete roadmap of measures to be taken by Sri Lanka and how to advance them. Japan recommends the steady implementation of these action plans. We hope that the government of Sri Lanka will make further efforts to engage with the international community, including a visit by the High Commissioner. At the same time, unresolved issues remain, to which we hope that the Sri Lankan government will respond. Regarding the issue of internally displaced persons in particular, Japan recommends that the government take continuous measures to secure social infrastructure and means of livelihood at resettlement sites, as this is expected to become even more vital. Japan remains committed to providing support towards Sri Lanka's national reconciliation through including the activities of Japan's envoy, Mr. Yasushi Akashi, and economic cooperation for less developed areas of the country. I thank you, Madam President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Kazakhstan.
Thank you, Madam President. Kazakhstan welcomes distinguished delegation of Sri Lanka. Kazakhstan commends achievements and efforts of the government of Sri Lanka in protecting and promoting human rights and fundamental freedoms of its citizens. Our delegation welcomes the military defeat of the terroristic organization of Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam and end of 30-year conflict in May 2009. Concerning the national report, we recommend the delegation of Sri Lanka, firstly, to further strengthen cooperation with the UN human rights mechanisms, particularly special procedures, and try to respond in a timely manner to the questionnaires sent by the special procedures. Secondly, to take steps to protect people from acts of terrorism, especially through domestic legislation. Kazakhstan recognizes Sri Lanka's efforts in securing and maintaining rights of women and children by implementing the Prevention of Domestic Violence Act, as well as establishing the National Child Protection Authority, which has a wide mandate with regard to the prevention of all forms of violence and abuse against children. In conclusion, our delegation wishes to witness further progress and realization of human rights within the non-discriminatory and transparent framework. Thank you, Madam President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Kenya.
Thank you, Madam President. Kenya commends the open and positive approach the government of Sri Lanka has maintained all along in her engagement with the human rights mechanisms, even at times in the face of unique critical challenges. This approach has led to Sri Lanka's valuable contribution to the work of the Human Rights Council. Sri Lanka has ratified 7 of the core international human rights instruments, and her commitment to the safeguard of fundamental freedoms is to be commended. As a recommendation, Kenya would encourage Sri Lanka to continue giving consideration to ratifying the other remaining instruments in a progressive manner. On a point of clarification, it would be interesting for Kenya to know what steps the government of Sri Lanka is taking to fully address and assure some concerns that persons belonging to certain minority religious groups at the local levels are not fully able to access the full enjoyment of their religious freedoms at par with persons belonging to other larger religious groups, mainly as a result of decisions and actions of local administrative bodies. Thank you, Madam.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Kuwait.
بداية يود وفد بلاد
Thank you, Madam President. My country's delegation wishes to welcome Mr. Samarasinghe and his delegation. We welcome the efforts made by the Sri Lankan government to strengthen human rights at the national level. This will has clearly been seen in the method adopted in preparing the national report, as also in the implementation of the National Plan of Action for Human Rights in 2008. Madam President, we have closely followed the developments following the conflict, which lasted 30 years. Security and stability have been re-established for all. The government has set up a reconciliation commission for the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission. We call upon Sri Lanka to continue with these measures in order to strengthen the protection of human rights, not to mention the other development goals set. Thank you. Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the Lao People's Democratic Republic.
Thank you, Madam President. The Lao delegation warmly welcome the delegation of Sri Lanka to 14th session of UPR Working Group. My delegation congratulates the achievement made by the government of Sri Lanka in integrating MDGs into the national development agenda and is on track on reaching most of the targets. The notable achievements are those related to equitable primary education, maternal and child mortality. We note that Sri Lanka is party to 7 core human rights treaties and 4 optional protocols, and is also signatory to Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. It has harmonized the international treaty to domestic legislation for ensuring promotion and protection of human rights in the country. My delegation wishes to encourage Sri Lanka government continues cooperate with the UN and other international organizations in developing further its legal and institutional framework with respect to promotion and protection of the human rights in the country. I thank you, Madam President.
Muchas gracias. Latvia, Letonia.
Madam President, report its presentation today and a constructive engagement in the UPR process. After studying carefully the national report and other relevant documents, we know that Sri Lanka has made efforts to improve its cooperation with the special procedures of the Human Rights Council. However, we also know that a significant number of requests by these special procedures mandate holders to visit Sri Lanka have not been accepted yet. Latvia recommends to Sri Lanka to step up its cooperation with the Special Rights Council. Latvia also recommends to Sri Lanka to ratify the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and to fully align its legislation with all the obligations under the Rome Statute, including incorporating the Rome Statute definition of crimes and general principles, as well as adopting provisions enabling cooperation with the Court. I thank you, Madam President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Lebanon, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Madam President. The delegation of Lebanon warmly welcomes the delegation of Sri Lanka, headed by the Special Envoy of the President on Human Rights, His Excellency Minister Sumarasinghe, and thanks him for the presentation of their national report. We commend the extensive efforts the Sri Lankan government deployed in developing the National Action Plan to address human rights issues in the country in an inclusive and consultative manner. We note in particular the commitment shown by the Sri Lankan government to safeguard the human rights of those affected by the internal conflicts that have torn apart the country for the last decades. We recommend the government to pursue the process of reconciliation and to consolidate the peace-building measures they have embarked on since the end of the conflict. I thank you.
Gracias, Excelencia.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Malaysia, please. Ambassador.
Thank you, Madam President. Malaysia welcomed the delegation of Sri Lanka to the 14th session of the UPR Working Group of the Council and thanks them for the presentation of their national report. We remain hopeful that the Sri Lanka's claim of effort to promote and protect the human rights of its people, such as poverty alleviation, education, and the rights of women and children, and the implementation of its action plan for the promotion and protection of human rights are sincere. Sri Lanka's long civil war was costly in all terms and tragic. It has now ended. Let us all work to ensure this terrible wound does not remain exposed to fester, but let us make sure that it's closed and medicated so it's healed properly. Genuine effort at reconciliation will achieve that. No one should presume to understand the difficulties of sectarian polarization of Sri Lanka, nor try to prescribe precise solution to the problem. Both communities must work out this problem in sincerity and genuine desire for peace. We recommend Sri Lanka to continue implementing the LLRC recommendations. We also recommend Sri Lanka to continue the efforts at strengthening its national institution for the promotion and protection of human rights and to encourage awareness among its people of the importance of fairness and justice.
Muchas gracias, Excelencia.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Maldives, Madam Ambassador.
Thank you, Madam President. The Maldives would like to welcome the distinguished minister and his delegation. The Maldives, as its close neighbor, understands the enormous challenges faced by Sri Lanka subsequent to 30 years of conflict, which Maldives understands that there must be accountability for violations of human rights committed by all sides. In this regard, we welcome Sri Lanka's National Plan of Action to implement the recommendations of the LLRC. It is a critically important step taken in the right direction, and we applaud the progress that has been made to date. The Maldives also recognizes that despite having to divert significant proportion of resources towards ending the conflict, Sri Lanka has recorded impressive achievements in social and economic indicators, including the MDGs. The Maldives would like to make the following recommendations. Firstly, to continue its efforts of implementing the recommendations of the National Plan of Action. Secondly, to ensure structural and operational independence of the National Human Rights Institution in accordance with the Paris Principles. 3, ratify at the earliest the OPCAT. I thank you, Madam President.
Gracias.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Mauritania.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President.
أرحب بوفد سري.
I'd like to welcome the delegation of Sri Lanka, headed up by His Excellency Mr. Samarasinghe, and I'd also like to extend the welcome to the whole delegation accompanying with him, and also to the members of the permanent mission here in Geneva. We have taken note of the very detailed report submitted by...
Thank you, Madam President.
Gracias.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Mauritania.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President.
أرحب بوفد سريلانكا وعلى.
I'd like to welcome the delegation of Sri Lanka, headed up by His Excellency Mr. Samarisinghe, and I'd also like to extend the welcome to the whole delegation accompanying with him, and also to the members of the permanent mission here in Geneva. We have taken note of the very detailed report submitted by the delegation of Sri Lanka, which does indeed reflect the Sri Lankan government's commitment to the protection and promotion of human rights, and their focus on the rule of law and democracy. My delegation welcomes the measures taken by the government that have been reported in the document to combat violence against children and against women, to ensure better protection of women. We all know that a process of reconciliation has been launched in this country, and we should like to have more information about difficulties encountered by Sri Lanka in achieving their objectives in this process. We are aware of the difficulties facing this country after 3 decades of conflict, and we should like to pay tribute to the impending visit of the High Commissioner and her team in September 2012. The President takes the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Mexico welcomes the delegation from Sri Lanka and thanks them for presenting their national report. We take note of the actions undertaken by the Sri Lankan government to address the recent history of human rights serious violations. Concerning developments subsequent to the first cycle review, Mexico would highlight the enormous challenges that Sri Lanka has had to cope with, given the devastating consequences of the armed conflict, and recognizes the efforts made to give a better living standard to the people of the country. So as to contribute to the commitment already entered into by Sri Lanka, Mexico takes the liberty of making the following recommendations: that the country undertake measures that will allow its citizens to have access to public information, particularly information on alleged violations of their human rights. Second, that the country maintain a public and accessible list of all people who are being detained in the country, including those who were detained because of incidents related to the armed conflict. And lastly, that it adopt the necessary legal measures to ensure that the National Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka abides by the Paris Principles. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Morocco. Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I would like first of all to thank the delegation of Sri Lanka headed by His Excellency Mr. Mahinda Samarasinghe for the national report submitted to our working group. Against this backdrop, my delegation commends the efforts by the Sri Lankan government to establish a national action plan to promote and protect human rights. By adopting this plan of action, Sri Lanka has become one of the small group of countries that has responded to the Vienna Conference appeal made in 1993 addressed to states to introduce such a mechanism. In this connection, my delegation would like to have more extensive information on the objectives of this plan of action, as well as the main areas that it covers. My delegation would also like to encourage Sri Lanka to keep the Council informed of the follow-up to this plan of action, particularly by telling us about the results of the initial assessment of the implementation planned for next December. Lastly, my delegation recommends that Sri Lanka persevere in its implementation of the National Action Plan and that it is broadly disseminated among the local populace, including in the official languages of the country. Madam President, my delegation congratulates Sri Lanka on the results chalked up in the MDG effort, particularly their incorporation in the National Development Agenda. My delegation particularly welcomes the achievements in the fields of free access or fair access to primary education, literacy, the fight to combat maternal and child mortality, and access to drinking water. We also would call on the government to redouble its efforts to achieve the MDGs. Thank you very much. I call on Myanmar.
Thank you, Madam President. Myanmar warmly welcomes the delegation of Sri Lanka. We appreciate the Sri Lanka comprehensive report and updated additional information on its endeavor to promote and protect human rights. Myanmar commends Sri Lanka for its achievement in the restoration of peace, stability, and harmony in the country after 30 years of internal conflict. Sri Lanka deserves due recognition from the international community, settlement of IDP, and the rehabilitation and reintegration of former combatants. Before concluding, my delegation would like to make the following recommendation: continue to promote and protect human rights through education and institutional reforms, and further improve the living standard of the people by reducing poverty and economic disparity. And thank you, Madam President.
Gracias. Nepal.
Thank you. Nepal, please. Ambassador.
President, Nepal warmly welcomes the delegation of Sri Lanka, led by His Excellency Mr. Mahinda Samarasinghe, to this UPR session. We commend Sri Lanka's efforts to implement the recommendations received during the first UPR in 2008. We also welcome the launching of the National Plan of Action for the promotion and protection of human rights in this regard. Despite facing a long-run conflict, Sri Lanka made tremendous achievements in socio-economic development. The country is on track to meet most of the MDG targets. Nepal appreciates a range of measures undertaken towards achieving the post-conflict reconciliation and efforts being made in the implementation of the LLR recommendations. My delegation recommends Sri Lanka the following: continue efforts in enhancing the welfare of all segments of society and the rights based on national context and characteristics. Continue efforts to strengthen national human rights institutions. We wish Sri Lanka a successful UPR. I thank you, Madam President.
Gracias, Excelente.
Thank you, Your Excellency. The Netherlands Ambassador, please.
Thank you, Madam President. The Netherlands would like to thank His Excellency Mr. Samarasinghe for the introduction of the National Report of Sri Lanka. The situation in Sri Lanka is different from that 4 years ago. We believe the government of Sri Lanka could further normalize the situation by implementing the report of the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission. We have two concrete recommendations for the government of Sri Lanka. First, freedom of expression and media, to refrain from restricting access to and banning from websites and withdraw the order of 5th November 2011, which requires news sites to be registered. Human rights defenders, to desist from campaigns and threats against human rights defenders, and to ensure the investigation by an independent police commission into missing persons from this group, in line with the LLRC report recommendations on involuntary disappearances in a wider context. Thank you, Madam President.
Gracias.
Thank you, Your Excellency. New Zealand.
Thank you, Madam President, and to Minister Samarasinghe for his presentation. New Zealand welcomes the opportunities for peace and stability in Sri Lanka following the end of decades-long conflict in 2009 and the steps Sri Lanka has since taken in this direction, such as the resettlement of internally displaced persons. While we note the specific post-conflict challenges, while we note progress made on the death penalty, including the current moratorium on executions, New Zealand recommends that Sri Lanka take immediate steps towards the abolition of the death penalty in law. New Zealand is pleased to see some progress on women's rights issues, but is concerned that substantial challenges remain, in particular domestic violence. New Zealand recommends that Sri Lanka enact urgent legislative amendments to the Penal Code to ensure that the rights of women from all religious and ethnic communities are safeguarded. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Nicaragua. Thank you very much, Madam President. Nicaragua extends a warm welcome to Sri Lanka and wishes it successful results in its Universal Periodic Review second cycle. Sri Lanka has had to confront a difficult internal situation in the last few years as a country, and despite this we have witnessed the commitment by the government to work on an ongoing basis to build the rule of law and strengthen democracy. We would highlight the cooperation displayed by Sri Lanka vis-à-vis this council through its resolve to inform us of progress in the country. We welcome along these lines the launching of a national human rights plan of action, which is the outcome of a process of participatory social consultations. Nicaragua hopes that the second UPR will have the country continue moving along the road to peace, reconciliation and national unity. Nicaragua wants to recommend that Sri Lanka maintain its efforts to uphold national dialogue, which will bring this country to a lasting peace, as well as its commitment to continue guaranteeing full exercise of human rights for all of its citizens. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nicaragua. I call upon Nigeria. Ambassador, please.
Madam President, Nigeria warmly welcomes the delegation of Sri Lanka and takes due note of the positive post-conflict developments in Sri Lanka, including the resettling of IDPs, rehabilitation and integration of first combatants, as well as policy of not prosecuting former child soldiers who are victims, not perpetrators. Nigeria also acknowledges the gains made under the LRRC process and welcomes establishment and progress being made in the implementation of a national human rights plan. We look forward to the outcome of the initial evaluation plan, and we encourage the participation of civil society in this. Nigeria is also pleased to note Sri Lanka's commitment to ensure safety and facilitate the work of media personnel and institutions. Press freedom is important for democracy and human rights. Finally, we will strongly commend Sri Lanka's active engagement with the Human Rights Council in order to achieve final success. Thank you, Madam President.
Gracias, Excelencia. Norway.
Thank you, Excellency. Norway, please.
Madam President, Norway welcomes the presentation of the national report by the delegation of Sri Lanka. We acknowledge Sri Lanka's challenges over the past 4 years and commend the achievements made, especially in the field of economic recovery. We would like to highlight 3 areas where we see potential for improvement. 1. In 2008, Sri Lanka pledged to investigate attacks and abductions of human rights defenders, journalists and civilians. Norway notes with concern the lack of progress in this area. We recommend that legislation to ensure the right to information is enacted and brought in line with international human rights standards. 2. Norway is concerned about the low number of elected women in Sri Lankan politics. We recommend that Sri Lanka takes concrete measures in implementing the 30% quota for women in the nomination lists at national, provincial and local elections, as pledged in the National Human Rights Action Plan. 3. Independent civilian institutions and power share mechanisms are of utmost importance to ensure democratic space. Norway recommends Sri Lanka to strengthen the independence of institutions such as the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, the Police Commission and Election Commission. Norway has been a long-standing partner to Sri Lanka. We would like to repeat our sincerity in supporting the country and its people through these crucial transition times. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. The distinguished delegation of Sri Lanka has asked me for permission to speak. You have the floor.
Honourable Minister, Madam President, a few issues I wish to deal with. Cooperation relating to treaty bodies. I wish to make clear that Sri Lanka accords the highest priority to active participation in multilateral treaty frameworks relating to human rights and is party to 7 core human rights treaties and 4 optional protocols. Sri Lanka has progressed in fulfilling its reporting obligations, including submitting its periodic reports to the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women in 2009, Committee Against Torture in 2011, and has provided responses to the list of issues raised by the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights 2010 and the confidential communications received from the UN Commission on the Status of Women. In addition, Sri Lanka last week submitted its 5th periodic report in accordance with Article 40 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR, highlighting the developments relevant to the period 2003 to 2012. Cooperation with special procedures, Sri Lanka values its engagement with the UN special procedures and has proactively engaged with the respective special procedures on human rights and has facilitated visits to Sri Lanka by a number of them. As part of the continuing engagement with the special procedure mechanisms, Sri Lanka also maintains a dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children in 2010, Special Rapporteur on Arbitrary Detention in 2010, the Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Summary and Arbitrary Executions 2009 and 12, and the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women in Law and Practice 2012. The representatives of the government has regularly interacted with members of the working group, including in March 2012 on the sidelines of the council session. As a part of this continuing dialogue, the Sri Lanka delegation attending the UPR sessions has now requested and has been granted a meeting with the working group tomorrow, 2nd November. Sri Lanka remains committed to engaging constructively with the working group in order to resolve outstanding issues and of alleged disappearances. As stated, with engagement of the OHCHR, an invitation was extended in April 2011 to the present UN High Commissioner Navinitham Pillai to visit the country, and in this context, a preparatory visit by a team from OHCHR to Sri Lanka took place in September 2012. In Sri Lanka, the team was accorded unfettered access to all locations and was provided with the opportunity of interacting with a broad range of stakeholders. They also undertook a field visit to the former conflict-affected northern province. Sri Lanka now awaits High Commissioner Pillai's visit to Sri Lanka. I thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much for this information on cooperation with the multilateral human rights system. And I'll give the floor to Oman.
سعادة الرئيسة يود
Madam President, the delegation of my country welcomes the Sri Lankan delegation, and we would like to thank the delegation for the information provided, and we would also express our full appreciation to the delegation for the way in which the report was drafted. The Sri Lankan government has made enormous efforts at the national, regional, and international levels to promote and protect human rights. This is clearly shown by the report that's been submitted to us through the implementation and the design of the plan of action for the rehabilitation and reintegration of victims of the conflict and ex-combatants, and to strengthen the reconciliation process within the overall framework of commitments entered into internationally and their implementation on the ground with a great sense of responsibility and enhanced cooperation among all actors. In this respect, we would recommend the designing of training programs for the police forces and civil society to raise awareness of human rights principles to preserve these norms and these rights. Thank you.
Gracias. Pakistan.
Thank you very much. Pakistan. Ambassador, you have the floor.
President, Pakistan warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of Sri Lanka led by His Excellency Mahinda Samarasinge to the UPR Working Group. Pakistan congratulates the government and the people of Sri Lanka for their victory against terrorism. This historic achievement deserves recognition by the international community. Pakistan welcomes the release of the National Action Plan for the implementation of the recommendations of the LLRC, as well as the establishment of the task force to monitor its implementation. Pakistan recommends Sri Lanka to take all possible steps in strengthening the capacity of government agencies identified for the implementation of the recommendations in this regard. Pakistan also welcomes the actions taken by the government of Sri Lanka to achieve reconciliation through the National Action Plan for the implementation of the recommendations of the LLRC, including the measures taken to address issues of accountability. We encourage continued action in this regard. In conclusion, we wish Sri Lanka the very best in its endeavors to promote and protect human rights. Thank you, Madam President.
Gracias.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Palestine.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President.
فلسطين أن يرحب بوفد سريلانكا الموقر
We would like to welcome the delegation from Sri Lanka headed by His Excellency the Minister Mahinda Samarasinge as part of the UPR. We thank this delegation for presenting the report as well, and we commend the efforts made to implement the recommendations already submitted to it. The Sri Lankan government, since the first cycle, has adopted even further measures for the promotion and protection of human rights. Progress has been recorded. Indeed, it has incorporated the MDGs in the National Plan of Action. In this respect, we welcome the efforts made by Sri Lanka to promote and protect the rights of women and its accession to most of the covenants and treaties in the area of human rights, above all, the agreements on freedom of belief. In addition, major measures have been adopted to protect the civilian population from all terrorist acts. We would call upon the state to pursue these efforts, above all through implementing the plan of action for the promotion and protection of human rights. We wish Sri Lanka even more progress in future. We are confident that they will manage to achieve these goals. Thank you very much. Philippines.
Comes the delegation of Sri Lanka, its comprehensive national report in the progress made by Sri Lanka in the field of human rights. My delegation acknowledges the great importance that Sri Lanka attaches to the UPR process as an interactive, collaborative, and exclusive mechanism. We appreciate Sri Lanka's voluntary pledges. We note, however, that the implementation of many of these pledges remains unfinished. The Philippines recommends that Sri Lanka continue its efforts to complete the implementation of these pledges. As a country of origin of migrant workers, my delegation welcomes Sri Lanka's deep concern for the protection of migrant workers. However, despite its accession in 1996 to the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers, Articles 76 and 77 of that convention remain unaccepted.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Poland.
Thank you, Madam President. Poland thanks the delegation of Sri Lanka for constructive participation in the UPR process and the presentation of its informative national report. While acknowledging Sri Lanka's efforts to improve its human rights record and to implement obligations aimed at reconciliation, democratization, and strengthening the rule of law, Poland would like to point out a few areas in which further measures should be taken. We are concerned about the effects of the 18th Constitutional Amendment of 2010 on the independence and integrity of the judiciary and oversight bodies. We also would like to share our concerns about the reports of a significant number of disappearances which have still not been clarified. Please provide information on the measures which have been taken to ensure protection of human rights defenders in Sri Lanka. The delegation of Poland would like to offer the following recommendations to Sri Lanka: to take all necessary measures to ensure the independence and the integrity of the judiciary and oversight bodies, to establish an effective independent monitoring mechanism to investigate complaints of torture, to carry out independent investigations into possible cases of torture, as well as reprisals related to cooperation with international human rights bodies. Thank you very much.
Gracias.
Thank you. Qatar.
السيد الرئيس أقدم وفد بلادي بجزيل الشكر إلى سعادة الوزير رئيس وفد جمهورية سريلانكا الاشتراكية الديمقراطية والوفد المرافق له على الإيضاحات الشاملة بخصوص حالة حقوق
Me disculpo, señor
I'm sorry, but there's no interpretation, so I would ask you if you could start your speech again, please. Thank you.
Madame la Présidente, j'aimerais tout d'abord remercier Son Excellence, Monsieur le Ministre, Monsieur Mahinda Samarasinghe, ainsi que la délégation qui l'accompagne pour les éclaircissements fournis en ce qui concerne
تم أخذها خلال خطة عمل وطنية لتعزيز
In particular, the adoption of a national plan of action aimed at the strengthening.
Adelante.
Go ahead, please.
السيد الرئيس.
Madam President, I would like first of all to thank His Excellency the Minister Mahinda Samarasinghe, as well as his accompanying delegation, for the clarifications they provided as to the human rights situation in Sri Lanka. Indeed, his explanations show that commitments undertaken during the first UPR have been fulfilled, in particular concerning the adoption of a plan of action for the promotion of human rights, without mentioning the efforts made to bring about national reconciliation and to rebuild the regions that were damaged during the conflict. I would like to submit two recommendations to Sri Lanka. First, they should draw upon fully the technical assistance provided by the international community with respect to the training of and enhancing of capacity of national human rights institutions. Second, Sri Lanka should pursue necessary efforts to speed up the implementation of the national plan of action throughout the country. In conclusion, we wish all success to Sri Lanka in the work being done to achieve greater progress and development. Thank you.
Por su paciencia, señor.
Thank you very much for your patience, distinguished delegate. Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. The Republic of Korea welcomes the delegation of the Sri Lanka to its second cycle of UPR. We acknowledge the progress made in the process of reconciliation, including the resettlement of IDP, reintegration of the former combatant of the LTTE, and the reconstruction of major aspects of the social infrastructure in the country. With this progress in mind, my delegation would like to make two recommendations. First, we would like to recommend that the government of Sri Lanka closely cooperate with the international community in implementing the recommendations by the LLRC and the National Action Plan for the Promotion and the Protection of Human Rights in the context of promoting reconciliation and accountability. Second, recognizing that the operational independence of the National Human Rights Commission has been critical, we recommend that the government of Sri Lanka take the necessary measures to further ensure its institutional independence. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Gracias.
Thank you. Romania, Madam Ambassador.
Thank you, Madam President. We welcome the delegation of Sri Lanka and thank for the presentation of the report. We appreciate a series of public initiatives recently taken by the government of Sri Lanka which demonstrate progress on human rights issues. We welcome the action plan launched this July for the implementation of the LRRC recommendations. We also know the cooperation of the government with the UN technical missions on human rights which visited Sri Lanka in September 2012. The issue of accountability is an important factor for the success of the reconciliation process. Some questions, however, in relation to human rights violations during the last stages of the war in 2009 are still pending. Some investigations of individual cases inside the military establishment have been also announced. We encourage the Sri Lankan authorities to make further progress in the reconciliation process as it is in the very national interest of Sri Lanka. Our questions, what are the government's plans for further ratification of several key human rights conventions in order to strengthen the country's human rights framework? We would notably refer to the second optional protocol of the ICCPR and OCPAT. In terms of accountability for alleged crimes that have not been addressed yet, what are the current mechanisms to investigate and, if necessary, to prosecute the reported cases of human rights violations? Thank you very much, Madam President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Excellency. The Russian Federation.
Madam President, the Russian Federation welcomes the delegation of Sri Lanka and thanks them for their detailed submission of the national report. The Russian Federation commends Sri Lanka on its successes in defending the rights of its citizens. We'd like to point out the active role, taking initiatives played by Sri Lanka in the United Nations Human Rights Council in working with the OHCHR and the sending in 2011 of an invitation to the High Commissioner to visit the country. We have sympathy for the difficulties Sri Lanka is encountering in ensuring human rights in the country. We welcome the activities of the Sri Lankan Human Rights Commission, the adoption and implementation of a national human rights plan of action, and also the amendments in September 2010 to the Sri Lankan Constitution, which further enhanced human rights protection in the country. We are pleased to note the process which has begun to implement the recommendations through the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission established in 2010. The Russian Federation recommends that Sri Lanka continue its policies aimed at improving the judicial system, reforming law enforcement bodies, and lowering the levels of crime and corruption. Thank you very much for your attention.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Rwanda.
I thank you, Madam President. Rwanda delegation welcomes the delegation of Sri Lanka and thanks them for the comprehensive presentation of their national report. Rwanda welcomes specific measures taken by the government of Sri Lanka to deal with the post-conflict period in various areas, including the resettlement of IDPs, the mining, and the rehabilitation of ex-combatants. My delegation further appreciates the decision of the government of Sri Lanka to set up a task force to monitor the implementation of the recommendation of the Commission of Inquiry on Lessons Learned and Reconciliation. Having in mind the positive achievement made by the government of Sri Lanka in the human rights field since the previous review, the delegation of Rwanda would like to recommend Sri Lanka to adopt appropriate and concrete measures to prevent the disadvantages and inequal status of women and girls. To conclude, Madam President, Rwanda would like to offer its best wishes to the government and people of Sri Lanka in the future endeavors toward the promotion and the protection of all human rights. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Saudi Arabia.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate.
Come His Excellency Mahinda Samara Singh and his delegation. كما أنتهز هذه الفرصة لأشيد بالتقرير الوطني لسريلانكا.
We'd like to thank Sri Lanka for the report they presented to us, which shows the efforts being made by Sri Lanka to promote human rights at all levels. I'd also like to pay tribute to the large involvement of civil society and NGOs working hand in hand with the government in preparing this report. Madam President, this report demonstrates Sri Lanka's commitment to international human rights treaties. Sri Lanka has indeed adopted a number of laws and pieces of legislation which are totally compatible with international UN standards. In addition, the national report urges to further promote economic development in the country. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Serbia, Ambassador, please.
Madam President, Serbia welcomes and greets the delegation of Sri Lanka. We are cognizant of the challenges and problems facing Sri Lanka, which to a certain extent inhibit the government's efforts to adequately and effectively implement many necessary measures for the promotion of human rights, including a number of recommendations by the UPR. Serbia salutes certain indicative achievements, such as those related to the adoption and implementation of the National Plan of Action, the rehabilitation of former child soldiers and ending of the further recruitment of child soldiers, ensuring protection, security, and interim housing solutions to the IDPs. The government of Sri Lanka is encouraged to pursue confidence-building and development programs in the former conflict zone, as well as to implement the adopted legislation and to adopt the new laws as per the UPR recommendations. Serbia strongly believes that the universal promotion and protection of human rights must rest on multilateral respect, confidence, and inclusive cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Singapore.
Thank you, Madam President. Singapore welcomes the high-level delegation of Sri Lanka and thanks them for their constructive engagement. Singapore recognizes the challenges faced by Sri Lanka as a country that has emerged only recently from a protracted internal conflict of nearly 30 years. We know the government's effort at national reconciliation to ensure enduring peace and to put the country on the path towards a sustainable economic recovery. We believe that the rule of law is key to ensuring stability, social justice, and equality, which in turn are important conditions for inclusive economic growth. We therefore recommend that Sri Lanka continue its effort in enhancing the rule of law to ensure long-term stability and sustainable development. Despite the challenges, we know that Sri Lanka has made progress in several areas to improve the well-being of its people, for example in education, as reflected in the consistent improvements of its Human Development Index since 2008. We recommend that it continues to improve accessibility to education, especially in the post-conflict and underdeveloped areas. In conclusion, we commend Sri Lanka for its achievements and wish it well on the path ahead. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Slovakia.
Madam President, I would like to extend a warm welcome to the delegation of Sri Lanka and thank it for the presentation of the national report and for its participation in the review process. Slovakia is aware of vast human rights challenges faced by Sri Lanka due to the dark heritage of the decades-long painful civil conflict. We would like to present the country the following recommendations. To implement recommendations of the UN panel of experts on accountability, bringing all those allegedly responsible for violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law to justice in compliance with international standards. To safeguard the independence of its judiciary, to ensure that all human rights defenders, including individuals cooperating with UN human rights mechanisms, are protected effectively from unjustified criminalization, harassment, or intimidation, and can perform freely their legitimate duties. And last but not least, to accede to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, including accession to its agreement on privileges and immunities. I thank you, Madam President.
Gracias, Eslovaquia.
Thank you, Slovakia. Slovenia, Ambassador, please.
I would like to thank the delegation of Sri Lanka for the national report, its presentation today, and their commitment to the UPR process. Sri Lanka has made a considerable efforts to improve the human rights situation in the country since first UPR cycle. Today, Slovenia would like to focus on two particular unresolved issues. SIDA referred to women and girls as having an equal status in various areas, such as in the workforce, in political representation, etc. SIDA called for the inclusion of a gender perspective in the national development agenda. Slovenia would like, therefore, to recommend to Sri Lanka to fully incorporate the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women into its domestic system. Various reports state that human rights defenders, defense lawyers, and other civil society actors, including political activists and journalists, are still subject to attacks and harassment. Slovenia would like to recommend to Sri Lanka to take immediate steps to prevent attacks on the human rights defenders and media and take action to investigate such acts. Thank you, Madam President.
Muchas gracias, Excelencia.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. South Africa.
Thank you, Madam President. The South African delegation welcomes the distinguished delegation of Sri Lanka and thanks the delegation for its report. The South African delegation is encouraged by steps taken by the government of Sri Lanka to address extreme poverty and progress towards the realization of the Millennium Development Goals, the elaboration of a national human rights action plan, initiatives to recycle persons who were displaced during the conflict, as well as ongoing demining activities. Given the challenges associated with armed conflict, the South African delegation recommends that the Sri Lankan government should continue to focus on establishing and strengthening institutions of government with a view to contributing towards adequate protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, provision of adequate remedies where violations occur, and zero tolerance for impunity. We recommend that all forms of violence against women be criminalized and perpetrators of such violence be held accountable. To address challenges related to the protection and fulfillment of the rights of children, we recommend that a comprehensive national strategy for the protection of the rights of children be formulated, also with a view to ensuring compliance with the Convention on the Rights of the Child following the review of national laws. Finally, the South African delegation recommends that Sri Lanka should continue to expand its social security coverage. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. South Sudan.
First, South Sudan conveys condolences to the families and victims of Hurricane Sandy in the United States of America. Moving on to Sri Lanka. South Sudan welcomes the delegation of Sri Lanka and acknowledges the reports on human rights and the post-conflict developments in the country. For example, demining, rehabilitation and reintegration of ex-combatants into society, resettlement of internally displaced persons, and the development of a new education policy and achieving the MDG goals in health and education sector. Recommendations: enable and additional resources to strengthen the Human Rights Commission. Disseminate in different languages the National Action Plan for the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights. Ensure ongoing protective measures to maintain and advance the levels of human rights developments. And fourth, to encourage women's participation in the public life of the country. South Sudan commends the post-conflict progress in Sri Lanka and wishes the best for the country in achieving the human rights objectives of its citizens. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Spain. Thank you. Spain extends a warm welcome to the delegation from Sri Lanka and thanks them for participating in this exercise. And we'd also like to express appreciation for the presentation made by His Excellency Mr. Mahinda Samaras-Singh. My delegation applauds the progress made in the promotion and protection of human rights by his authorities and appreciates the great efforts made in the field. My delegation would like to submit the following recommendations. First, that the country ratify the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons Against Enforced Disappearances. It ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the International Criminal Court Statute. That it abolish once and for all the death penalty. That it improve detention conditions and respect for judicial guarantees for inmates, combating torture and inhuman and degrading treatment in detention facilities in line with the commitments assumed during the UPR meeting in May 2008 for adopting the necessary measures to ensure that gender equality is a reality in legal terms and also practical terms, combating particularly gender violence, and also that it increased efforts made to guarantee the right to freedom of religion in Sudan. Ambassador, you have the floor.
يرحب وفد السودان بوفد حكومة سريلانكا الصديقة.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to the delegation of Sri Lanka, headed by Mr. Samarasinghe. I thank him for the report he presented to us, showing the human rights situation in Sri Lanka and also describing the efforts being made by the government to take up the human rights challenges of the country. The armed conflict there was one of the most difficult trials, and this is true everywhere in the world. Many do not understand the challenges that result after an armed conflict, particularly challenges for human rights. Sudan is in a good position to know very much about that. We welcome the efforts of Sri Lanka, which has just emerged from 30 years of bloody conflict. In particular, we pay tribute to the efforts to restore stability, to promote respect for human rights, and to comply with international conventions. We have two recommendations. First of all, Sri Lanka step up its efforts to implement the recommendations of the LLRC. And secondly, they continued their efforts for the return of internally displaced persons. Thirdly, that they must promote capacity building in law enforcement agencies, particularly by making them sensitive to human rights issues. Thank you.
Excelencia, Swazilandia.
Thank you very much, Excellency. Swaziland.
Madam President, Swaziland welcomes the statement by Honorable Minister Samarasinghe. We note that the implementation of the National Action Plan for the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights is on track. We are also encouraged by the government's focus towards the development of the northern and eastern provinces, which as a result of the conflict had not received proper and adequate attention. We trust that this will go a long way into achieving the government's endeavor for equal development within its territories. Furthermore, the establishment of the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission in 2010 attests to the government's steadfast belief that one of the best methods to achieve and maintain peace is through the creation of human rights safety nets that would encourage dialogue and compromise. Madam President, we all know that the promotion and protection of human rights is always work in progress. And as such, we would like to recommend that the government invest more resources towards a better service delivery mechanism that will also ensure that the remaining internally displaced citizens return safely to their territories. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Sweden.
Thank you, Madam President. Sweden wishes to thank Minister Samaringe and his delegation for the presentation of your national report. Sweden is pleased to note that the number of reported enforced disappearances has decreased since the last UPR. Nevertheless, civil society organizations have questioned the impartiality of the parties tasked with investigating enforced disappearances, and therefore Sweden recommends the government of Sri Lanka to sign the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. At the last UPR, Sri Lanka accepted the recommendation to adopt measures related to child soldiers. However, there remains concerns over the absence of criminal convictions related to the recruitment of child soldiers. Sweden recommends that every effort is made to ensure that those responsible for crimes against children, and then particularly concerning the recruitment of child soldiers, are brought to justice as soon as possible. Finally, Sweden would like to recommend Sri Lanka to take all necessary steps to fully commit to end impunity for international crimes by acceding to the Rome Statute of the ICC and to fully align its national legislation with all obligations under the Rome Statute. Thank you, Madam President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Switzerland. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Madam President, Switzerland welcomes the delegation of Sri Lanka and thanks for their national report. Switzerland notes that Sri Lanka is still not given proper follow-up at the national and international level to the report of experts with a mandate from the Secretary General of the United Nations. Switzerland recommends that Sri Lanka carry out an independent and credible investigation of the allegations of human rights violations and violations of international humanitarian law. The problem of forced disappearances remains a matter of concern. Switzerland recommends the establishment of a national mechanism, as requested indeed in the report of the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission report, to shed light on the fate of all disappeared persons and detained persons, and to cooperate with the ICRC and the Working Group on Forced or Involuntary Disappearances. The legitimate grievances of minorities also require a lasting solution through inclusive dialogue. Switzerland recommends that such a dialogue be initiated through a mechanism which would guarantee minority representatives a fair joint decision power on the basis of the 4 previous decisions, the APRC all-party majority report, the expert majority report, the proposals for constitutional reforms, and the Mangala report. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Excellencia.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. The Syrian Arab Republic.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Madam President. We welcome the delegation of Sri Lanka and thank them for their transparent professional report submitted to us for the UPR. UPR remains the ideal mechanism for discussing human rights situations in each and every country. The government of Sri Lanka has managed in a very short time to emerge from the spiral of violence that it had been bogged down in, despite huge challenges that the country still faces. I would like to welcome the achievements made by Sri Lanka, particularly in implementing the recommendations of the Reconciliation Commission, in particular with respect to the rehabilitation of former soldiers. We would recommend that Sri Lanka continue to work actively through the UPR and through other United Nations mechanisms. Madam President, we would like to make a few recommendations. First of all, Sri Lanka continue the implementation of its National Human Rights Action Plan. Second, continue the return of return of internally displaced persons, in particular paying compensation to IDPs so they'll be able to return to their homes. Third, continue the human rights awareness campaigns, particularly for soldiers and police. Thank you.
Thank you. This was the last speaker on my list, and therefore it is great pleasure for closing remarks to give the floor back to His Excellency Mr. Mahinda Samarasinghe. You have the floor, sir.
Madam President, thank you very much for facilitating this discussion of Sri Lanka's UPR. We are very appreciative of the very efficient manner in which you conducted these proceedings. And I'm also very appreciative of the many interventions that were made during this period of about 3.5 hours. As much as we are encouraged with the interventions, acknowledging the positive steps that Sri Lanka has been taking, the progress that we have made, we have also noted the concerns expressed by our friends in the international community. Let me assure through you, Madam President, our friends in the Council, that we will work harder to ensure that the remaining challenges are the surmountable challenges are cleared, so that when we come back for the next Council sitting, we will be able to put on record further progress that Sri Lanka has achieved. I want to also mention, Madam President, that last March, when we met in this very room, there was a resolution against Sri Lanka. This resolution was adopted by the Council, and the subject of the resolution was the domestic process that Sri Lanka had put into place, emanating from the independent commission looking at what had happened during the course of the conflict. And what we have today reported to our friends in the international community is that we have, in fact, taken action to bring forth an operational plan of action. The LLRC operational plan has been put out by our government. It is being implemented as we speak, and we have made it known to this Council that on many fronts progress has been achieved. But we still acknowledge at the same time that there are challenges ahead of us. There are many areas that we have to work harder, that we have to record progress on, and as I mentioned earlier, Madam President, when we come back in March, we are very hopeful and we are very positive that we would be able to place on record further progress that Sri Lanka has achieved. Madam President, in conclusion, what we ask our friends in the international community is to acknowledge the progress that has been made and at the same time give us the time and space to work towards further progress. We are working for a new Sri Lanka. We are working for a united Sri Lanka. We, more than anyone else, are concerned about achieving comprehensive reconciliation. And we would like our friends in the international community to understand and appreciate this and constructively engage with Sri Lanka so that we could achieve this very important objective of winning the peace and ensuring comprehensive reconciliation so that Sri Lanka would never ever have to face the 30 years of conflict that we had to face, which tore our country apart, which affected economic growth, which affected the well-being of people, and which affected the unity of our nation. Today we are in the process of putting in place various strategies to foster unity amongst our people. And I want to end, Madam President, by saying that Sri Lanka is a multicultural, multilingual, and multi-religious community. We are proud of this diversity that we have. And what we are geared towards doing, what we are positive about doing, is to ensure that this diversity is protected and nurtured so that through that protection of the diversity and unity, that we would be able to cultivate a true Sri Lankan identity. So having said that, Madam President, thank you very much once again for facilitating this discussion, and we will continue to update this Council on further progress that Sri Lanka would make. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much, Your Excellency Minister Samarasinghe, and thank you also for this constructive participation in the second UPR. Thank you, your entire delegation. Thank you for this commitment to continue working towards a united and diverse Sri Lanka and meeting pending challenges. And we would like to hear from you on your progress and hope to keep reporting back. I would like to remind you that the report of this review will be prepared by the members of the Troika, that is the representatives of Benin, Spain and India. It is planned that the report will be distributed and adopted on Monday, the 5th of November after 3 p.m. I would also like to inform you that in accordance with the timetable for the session, the draft working group report of Zambia will be distributed to all missions and posted on the UPR extranet at 6 p.m. We have thus completed the reviews of all 14 states for this session. The working group will start its work again tomorrow at 3 p.m. to adopt the UPR reports of Pakistan, Zambia, and Japan. Once again, I would like to thank the distinguished delegation of Sri Lanka and wish them all success as they move forward at the national level. Thank you very much. This meeting is hereby adjourned, and I would like to thank the interpreters, of course. States for this session. The working group will start its work again tomorrow at 3 p.m. to adopt the UPR reports of Pakistan, Zambia, and Japan. Once again, I would like to thank the distinguished delegation of Sri Lanka and wish them all success as they move forward at the national level. Thank you very much. This meeting is hereby adjourned, and I would like to thank the interpreters, of course.